They say a man can survive alone in the Montana wilderness, but he can't truly live. Elias Ward learned that the hard way, spending 3 bitter winters rebuilding his family's ranch with nothing but ghosts for company. He'd convinced himself he needed no one, wanted nothing beyond survival. Then she arrived on a December stagecoach, stepping into the snow like something out of a dream he'd forgotten how to have. One look at Clara Whitford, and everything he thought he knew about loneliness shattered like ice underfoot. Stay with me until the end of this story, and comment which city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. The wind came down from the Rockies like a living thing, hungry and mean, rattling the windows of Murphy's General Store where Elias Ward stood counting out coins for coffee and lamp oil. December in Montana Territory had teeth, and 1885 was shaping up to be a winter that would be remembered, the kind that buried cattle standing up and turned men's beards to ice before they could reach their own front doors. Elias didn't mind. Cold he could handle. Cold was honest. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't, didn't make promises it couldn't keep. 3 winters he'd spent alone on the Circle W ranch, and he'd learned to prefer the company of silence to the complications people brought with them. "That'll be $2 even," old Murphy said, his weathered hands wrapping the goods in brown paper. "You staying in town for the Christmas social, Ward? Widow Harrison's been asking after you." Elias handed over the coins without meeting the storekeeper's eyes. "Got cattle to feed." "Always got cattle to feed," Murphy muttered, but he knew better than to push. Everyone in Pine Creek knew better than to push Elias Ward. The young rancher had earned his reputation for solitude honestly, carved it out of grief and hard winters, and the kind of silence that settled into a man's bones, until it became part of who he was. Elias was tucking his purchases into his saddlebag when he heard it. The distant jingle of trace chains and the unmistakable rumble of stagecoach wheels on frozen ground. He frowned. The stage wasn't due until Thursday, and today was only Tuesday. No driver in his right mind would push through the mountain passes early, not with the snow coming down the way it had been. But there it was, rolling down Pine Creek's single main street like an apparition, the 4-horse team blowing steam into the frigid air, their coats thick with frost. The coach itself was caked with snow and ice, the leather curtains drawn tight against the cold. Half the town had already gathered by the time the stage pulled up in front of the Pine Creek Hotel, folks drawn out by curiosity and the rare excitement of unexpected arrivals. Elias hung back, one hand on his horse's neck, telling himself he had no business being interested in whoever was fool enough to travel in this weather. The driver, a grizzled man named Hutchins, who Elias knew by reputation, climbed down from the box with the stiff movements of someone who'd been frozen in place for too many hours. "Wasn't planning on making this run," Hutchins called out to no one in particular, his voice rough as gravel. "But Mr. Whitford here paid triple to get through, and my mama didn't raise no fool when it comes to money." The coach door opened and a man stepped out first, late 50s, well-dressed in an Eastern-cut suit that looked ridiculous in the Montana snow, with silver-shot hair and the kind of posture that spoke of money and authority. He turned back to the coach, extending a gloved hand. That's when Elias saw her. She took her uncle's hand. Elias assumed it was her uncle from the way the man fussed over her, and stepped down into the snow-covered street, and Elias felt something in his chest go tight and strange, like he'd forgotten how to breathe properly. She wasn't beautiful in the way of the frontier women Elias knew, rough-hewn and weathered by wind and work. She was something else entirely, refined, delicate almost, with dark hair pinned up beneath a traveling bonnet and a wool coat that marked her as clearly Eastern as a brand on cattle. But there was something in the way she held herself, straight-backed and clear-eyed as she surveyed the town, that suggested steel beneath the silk. The wind caught at her skirts, and she didn't flinch. Instead, she turned her face into it, and Elias saw her smile, actually smile, at the bite of Montana winter like it was something to be welcomed rather than endured. "This is Pine Creek?" Her voice carried clear across the street, melodic and educated, with crisp consonants that spoke of finishing schools and drawing rooms. "Uncle James, it's perfect." The older man, James Whitford, apparently, looked less convinced. "It's freezing, Clara. Let's get you inside before you catch your death." But Clara Whitford wasn't hurrying anywhere. She stood in the middle of the street, snow settling on her shoulders like lace, taking in the rough buildings, the mountains rising sharp against the gray sky, the handful of curious townsfolk gathering to stare. Her gaze swept across the scene with what looked like genuine wonder, and when her eyes met Elias's across the distance, he felt it like a physical thing, a jolt of recognition that made no sense, a connection to someone he'd never met and had no business noticing. She held his gaze for a heartbeat, two, then her uncle was guiding her toward the hotel, and the moment broke. Elias forced himself to turn away, to focus on tightening his saddle cinch with hands that had gone clumsy. "Now that's something you don't see every day," a voice said at his elbow. Elias didn't need to look to know it was Doc Brennan, the town's physician and one of the few people whose company Elias occasionally tolerated. "Eastern lady, unless I miss my guess. Whitford. That name rings a bell. Timber money, maybe." "Not my concern," Elias said shortly. Doc Brennan chuckled, a knowing sound that set Elias's teeth on edge. "Saw the way you looked at her, Ward. Might be more your concern than you think." "I looked at the stagecoach. Wondered what fool would pay triple to travel in this weather." "Keep telling yourself that." Doc clapped him on the shoulder. "But I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, and I know that look. Your daddy wore it the first time he saw your mama." Elias swung into the saddle, eager to put distance between himself and the conversation, between himself and the woman he had no business thinking about. "My daddy's dead, Doc. So's my mama. So's everyone who used to make the Circle W a home. I'm not looking for anything except to get through another winter." He urged his horse into motion before Doc could respond, heading out of town at a pace just shy of running away. But even as Pine Creek fell behind him and the familiar solitude of the ranch road stretched ahead, Elias couldn't shake the image of Clara Whitford standing in the snow, smiling at the wind like it held secrets she wanted to learn. The Circle W greeted him the way it always did, silent, snow-covered, bearing the scars of 3 hard years of one-man operation. The main house still stood solid, built by his father's hands from timber cut from their own land, but the outbuildings showed their neglect. The barn needed new shingles. The corral fence had posts that wanted replacing. The bunkhouse, where hired hands used to sleep through the winter, sat empty and dark. Elias had stopped seeing these things as failures somewhere in the second year. Now they were just facts, like the fact that he ate alone and slept alone and worked alone, like the fact that Christmas was 2 weeks away and there'd be no stockings hung, no pine boughs over the doorway, no laughter warming the spaces between the walls. He saw to his horse first. A rancher's priorities never changed, no matter how scattered his thoughts, then hauled his supplies inside. The house was cold. He built up the fire, set coffee on to boil, and tried to settle into the evening routine that had sustained him through 3 winters of isolation. But Clara Whitford's face kept intruding on his thoughts, the way she'd smiled at the winter wind, the directness of her gaze when it had found his, the sound of her voice calling Pine Creek perfect, like she saw something in this hard country that he'd forgotten to look for. Elias told himself it didn't matter. She was passing through, obviously, a tourist seeking authentic Western experience, or perhaps visiting family for the holidays. She'd be gone by New Year's, back to whatever Eastern city had produced such an unlikely creature, and he'd forget he'd ever seen her. The certainty of this should have brought relief. Instead, it sat in his chest like a stone. The next morning dawned clear and bitter cold, the kind of cold that turned breath to ice crystals and made horses reluctant to leave the shelter of the barn. Elias was up before dawn as always, moving through his chores with the methodical efficiency of long practice. Feed the cattle, break the ice on the water troughs, check the horses, split wood for the stove. The work was good. It kept his hands busy and his mind occupied, left no room for wondering about Eastern women who smiled at blizzards. He was in the barn mending tack when he heard the rider approaching. Elias didn't get many visitors, didn't want them, generally, so the sound of hoofbeats on the frozen ground brought him to the barn door, one hand resting on the pistol he kept on his hip. A man alone couldn't be too careful, even in territory as relatively settled as this. But it wasn't trouble riding up to the Circle W. It was Tommy Chen, the half-Chinese kid who ran errands for the hotel and anyone else willing to pay him a few cents. The boy sat astride a shaggy pony that looked half asleep, his breath steaming in the morning air. "Mr. Ward!" Tommy called out, his young voice bright with the importance of his errand. "Got a message for you from town." Elias walked out to meet him, frowning. "Who's sending me messages?" "Mr. Whitford, sir, the gentleman who came in on yesterday's stage." Tommy dug into his coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper sealed with wax. "He said it was urgent and I should wait for your reply." Elias took the paper, turning it over in his hands. The paper was fine quality, the kind that cost money, and the seal was pressed with what looked like a family crest. He cracked it open and scanned the contents, his frown deepening with each line. "Mr. Ward, I am informed by Mr. Murphy and Dr. Brennan that you are the most experienced guide in this region, particularly regarding the mountain territories west of Pine Creek. I find myself in need of such expertise. I am conducting a timber survey for my company and require safe passage through the high country to assess certain tracks. Given the season and conditions, I understand this is no small ask. I am prepared to pay handsomely for your services, $200 for 2 weeks of your time plus expenses. I would like to depart as soon as possible, weather permitting. Please respond at your earliest convenience. I am staying at the Pine Creek Hotel. Respectfully, James Whitford." Whitford Timber and Lumber, Boston. $200. Elias read the figure twice to make sure he hadn't misunderstood. That was more than he'd clear from selling cattle in a good year, more than he'd seen in one place since before his parents died. $200 could fix the barn roof, replace the worn tack, buy seed for spring planting, and still leave enough to get him through next winter comfortably. It was also a damn fool errand. The high country in December was nothing to play with. Even experienced men died up there when the weather turned, got caught in whiteouts or avalanches, froze to death in the night if they lost their way. And this Whitford wanted to go survey timber stands? In the dead of winter? Elias should refuse. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to send Tommy back with a polite no, and forget about timber surveys and Boston money, and Clara Whitford, who would presumably be staying in town while her uncle tramped around the mountains. Clara, who would be there when he came back down for supplies, who he might see in passing, who he could ignore with the practice of 3 years' solitude. Or Clara, who might come along on the survey. The thought struck him with uncomfortable certainty. She hadn't looked like the type to sit quietly in a hotel room while adventure happened elsewhere. She'd stood in the snow with wonder on her face, not fear. "Mr. Ward?" Tommy shifted in his saddle, patient but curious. "Should I tell Mr. Whitford you'll do it?" Every instinct Elias had cultivated over 3 lonely years screamed at him to refuse. Money wasn't worth complications. Money wasn't worth risking the careful emotional distance he'd built between himself and the rest of humanity. But $200 was $200. And maybe, whispered a traitorous voice in the back of his mind, maybe this was the universe's way of testing whether he was truly as content in his isolation as he pretended to be. "Tell Mr. Whitford I'll meet him at the hotel tomorrow morning at 8, Elias heard himself say. "And tell him if he's planning to bring anyone who isn't prepared for hard travel and rough conditions, he should reconsider. The high country doesn't care about money or manners." Tommy grinned, pleased to have successfully completed his errand. "Yes, sir. I'll tell him exactly that." The boy wheeled his pony around and kicked it into a trot, calling back over his shoulder, "He's going to be real pleased, Mr. Ward. Him and his niece both." And there it was. Confirmation that Clara would likely be part of this expedition. Elias stood in his barnyard long after Tommy disappeared from view, trying to convince himself that the tight feeling in his chest was apprehension about the journey, nothing more. He failed utterly. The ride into Pine Creek the next morning felt longer than usual, though Elias knew every rock and tree along the way. He'd dressed in his best, which wasn't saying much, just a clean shirt under his sheepskin coat and trousers without patches, and tried to tell himself it was simple professionalism, not any desire to make a decent impression on a woman he barely knew. The town was quiet at this early hour, smoke rising straight up from chimneys in the still air. Elias tied his horse outside the hotel and climbed the steps to the porch, boot heels loud on the wooden planks. Before he could reach for the door, it swung open. James Whitford stood in the doorway, dressed for business in wool trousers and a heavy coat, a leather satchel over one shoulder. Up close, he looked every bit the successful Eastern businessman, well-fed, confident, accustomed to being obeyed. "Mr. Ward, I presume." Whitford extended his hand and Elias shook it, noting the firm grip. "Thank you for coming. I realize this is an unusual request." "It's a dangerous request," Elias said bluntly. "The high country in winter isn't like your city parks, Mr. Whitford. Men die up there." "Which is precisely why I need an experienced guide." Whitford gestured toward the hotel's small dining room. "Please, come in. We should discuss the particulars. Clara is just finishing breakfast." And there she was, seated at a table near the window where morning light caught the dark shine of her hair. She'd traded yesterday's traveling clothes for something more practical. A split riding skirt in dark wool, a crisp white blouse, sturdy boots that looked barely worn. She looked up as they entered, and her face transformed with a smile that hit Elias like a fist to the solar plexus. "You must be Mr. Ward," she said, rising to greet him with an extended hand, utterly ignoring the impropriety of a woman initiating such contact. "I'm Clara Whitford. I'm so glad you agreed to guide us." Elias took her hand, finding it smaller than expected, but with a surprisingly firm grip. "Ma'am, I should tell you straight, this isn't going to be a pleasure trip. If you're expecting scenic overlooks and gentle trails, you'll be disappointed." Those clear eyes, he could see now they were gray, like winter skies, met his without flinching. "I'm expecting honest work in country that doesn't forgive mistakes. I've read enough about the territory to know what winter in the mountains means. Reading about it and living it are different things. Which is why we've hired you." She tilted her head slightly, studying him with an intensity that made Elias want to look away. "Uncle James told me you've spent 3 winters alone on your ranch. That suggests either remarkable capability or remarkable stubbornness." Despite himself, Elias felt his mouth twitch toward a smile. "Most folks would say both, ma'am." "Clara," she corrected, "if we're going to spend 2 weeks traveling together, we should dispense with excessive formality." She gestured to the empty chair at their table. "Please, sit. Would you like coffee?" The next hour passed in a blur of planning and logistics. James Whitford spread maps across the table, showing the timber tracts he wanted to survey, 3 different locations, all in the high country west of Pine Creek, all requiring several days' travel, even in good conditions. He asked intelligent questions about weather patterns, safe routes, necessary supplies. Clara sat quietly through most of it, but Elias noticed the way she studied the maps, her finger tracing elevation lines and water sources. "We'll need pack horses," Elias said finally. 4, minimum. "And I'm bringing my own mounts. I know their capabilities. You'll each need cold weather gear beyond what you've got. Mrs. Henderson at the Mercantile can outfit you proper, and we're not leaving until I'm satisfied you can both handle the riding required." "I've been riding since I was 6, Clara said quietly. "Eastern riding schools and mountain trails aren't the same, Ma. Clara." "Then test me." She stood, challenge clear in her voice. "Right now. I'd like to know if you think I'm capable before we waste more time planning." Elias looked to James Whitford, who shrugged with the air of a man long accustomed to his niece's independence. "She's quite serious, Mr. Ward, and quite capable, though I'll let her prove that herself." 20 minutes later, they stood in the livery stable behind the hotel. Elias had selected one of his steadier horses, a bay mare named Patience who'd carried him through more than one tight spot, and watched as Clara approached the animal with confident ease. She spoke softly to the mare, letting the horse catch her scent, running practiced hands along neck and shoulder before accepting the saddle Elias offered. She tacked up efficiently, adjusting stirrups and checking the girth with motions that spoke of genuine experience. Then she swung into the saddle with a grace that made Elias revise several assumptions, settling her weight and gathering the reins like someone who actually understood horses. "Where would you like me to ride?" she asked. "Out past Murphy's and back. Let's see how you handle her." Clara touched her heels to Patience's sides and moved out at a smooth walk that transitioned to a trot, then a controlled canter. Elias watched the way she moved with the horse, balanced and natural, no stiffness or fear. She took the mare through the turns smoothly, brought her back to a walk without sawing at the reins, and returned to the stable with color in her cheeks and satisfaction in her eyes. "Will I do, Mr. Ward?" There was a hint of amusement in her voice. "You'll do." Elias took Patience's reins as Clara dismounted. But sitting a horse in town and staying in the saddle for 8 hours through mountain country are different things. Then I suppose I'll learn the difference. She smiled at him, and Elias felt that strange tightness in his chest again. When do we leave? Day after tomorrow. Gives you time to get proper gear, and me time to pack the supplies we'll need. He paused, weighing his next words. I meant what I said about this being dangerous. I need you to understand that if the weather turns or conditions get bad, I make the decisions. No arguments, no debates. Lives might depend on it. Something shifted in Clara's expression, humor fading into seriousness. I understand, Mr. Ward. I'm not fool enough to gamble with survival. Elias, he heard himself say, if we're dispensing with formality. Her smile returned, softer this time. Elias, then. The way she said his name carefully, like she was tasting something new, sent an entirely inappropriate warmth through him. Elias stepped back, putting distance between them, reminding himself sternly that she was a client. This was business, and the last thing he needed was to develop inconvenient feelings for an Eastern woman who'd be gone with the spring thaw. But as he rode back to the Circle W that afternoon, supplies list in his pocket and $200 promised, Elias couldn't quite convince himself that business was all this was. Something had shifted when Clara Whitford stepped off that stagecoach, and he had the uneasy feeling that 2 weeks in close quarters with her was going to shift it even further. The question was whether he had the strength to resist that shift, or whether, somewhere deep down, he'd already stopped wanting to. 2 days proved barely enough time to prepare. Elias worked from dawn until well past dark, checking and rechecking supplies with the kind of obsessive thoroughness that had kept him alive through 3 Montana winters. Rope, tarps, extra blankets, medical supplies, matches sealed in wax, dried meat, hardtack, coffee, grain for the horses. He packed enough for 3 weeks, though they planned for 2, because the mountains had a way of making liars out of even the best-laid plans. On the morning of departure, he rode into Pine Creek leading 4 pack horses, their panniers loaded and balanced with precision. The sky was that peculiar pale blue that often preceded heavy weather, and the air had a waiting quality that made Elias's instincts prickle with warning. But James Whitford was paying for December passage, and December passage was what he'd get, weather be damned. Clara was waiting outside the hotel, dressed in the gear Mrs. Henderson had assembled, wool trousers under a split skirt, a heavy coat lined with fur, gloves, a hat that would actually keep her ears from freezing. She looked less like an Eastern lady and more like someone who might survive what was coming, which eased some of Elias's concern. "Good morning," she called out, her breath steaming. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Said I would." Elias swung down from his saddle, checking the pack horse's leads. "Where's your uncle?" "Inside, settling the bill. He'll be out momentarily." Clara approached the horses, greeting each one with the same gentle confidence she'd shown with Patience. "What are their names?" "Don't have names. They're horses." She looked at him with raised eyebrows. "You've had some of these animals for years and never named them?" "Naming things makes them harder to lose." The words came out more honestly than Elias had intended, and something flickered across Clara's face, understanding, maybe, or sympathy. Before she could respond, James Whitford emerged from the hotel, his own gear marking him as well-prepared if somewhat overdressed for the trail. "Mr. Ward, right on time." Whitford offered his hand. "I appreciate punctuality. In the mountains, timing can mean the difference between living and dying." Elias gestured to the horse he'd selected for Whitford, a steady gelding named Buck, who'd carried greenhorns before. "That's yours. Clara, you'll ride Patience again since you two got along. Mount up and let's see how you handle the weight of your supplies." They rode out of Pine Creek with half the town watching, which was standard for any expedition into the high country during winter. Doc Brennan raised a hand in farewell. Mrs. Henderson called out to be careful. Tommy Chen waved enthusiastically from the steps of the mercantile. Elias set a steady pace, not too fast but not dawdling either. The first day's ride would take them through relatively gentle country, following the valley northwest before the real climbing began. He wanted to gauge how his clients handled long hours in the saddle before the terrain got serious. Clara rode behind him, with James bringing up the rear and the pack horses strung between. For the first hour, Nobody spoke much beyond necessary communication about the trail. Elias appreciated the silence. Too many greenhorns felt compelled to fill every moment with chatter, not understanding that in the wilderness, listening was often more important than talking. But as the morning wore on and the rhythm of travel settled into their bones, Clara urged Patience up alongside Elias's mount. He glanced over, noting the way she sat the saddle with increasing confidence, her posture relaxed but alert. "How long have you been guiding in these mountains?" she asked. "Don't guide. This is the first time I've hired out for it." She looked surprised. "Then why did Doc Brennan and Mr. Murphy recommend you to my uncle?" "Because I know this country better than anyone else still living. Spent every summer from age 6 exploring these mountains with my father. He was—" Elias paused, surprised at how easily the words wanted to come. "He was a trapper before he turned to ranching. Taught me to read weather, track game, survive when survival seemed impossible." "Was?" "Influenza took him 4 years back. Took my mother and younger sister too, all in the same week." The facts came out flat, emotionless, the way Elias had learned to deliver them. "Left me the ranch and not much else." Clara was quiet for a long moment, and Elias braced himself for the usual platitudes. "I'm so sorry. How terrible. You must miss them dreadfully." But when she spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than pitying. "That's why you spent 3 winters alone. You were rebuilding more than just a ranch." The observation cut too close to truths Elias preferred not to examine. "The ranch needed work. Still does. And you needed solitude. Solitude's easier than the alternative." "Is it?" Clara's gray eyes studied him with that unsettling directness. "Or is it just familiar?" Before Elias could formulate a response that didn't reveal too much, James Whitford called out from behind them, "How much farther to today's stopping point?" Elias twisted in his saddle, grateful for the interruption. "Another 4 hours to the line cabin at Crooked Creek. We'll shelter there tonight, head into the high country tomorrow." They rode on through country that grew progressively more rugged, following game trails and old trappers' paths that Elias knew by heart. The mountains rose around them, snow-covered peaks sharp against the sky, and Elias found himself seeing the landscape through Clara's eyes. Not just obstacles to overcome, but beauty worth witnessing. She didn't exclaim over every vista or demand they stop for photographs like some tourists he'd heard about. Instead, she absorbed it quietly, her gaze tracking the flight of an eagle overhead, the delicate architecture of ice along the creek banks, the way afternoon light turned the snow to gold. "It's so much bigger than I imagined," she said at one point, almost to herself. "The books don't capture it. The photographs don't do it justice." "Most things worth seeing can't be captured," Elias said. "Only experienced." "Is that why you stay? Even alone, even with all the hardship, you stay because of this?" The question should have annoyed him with its presumption. Instead, Elias found himself actually considering it, turning it over in his mind like a stone from the creek bed. "I stay because it's home," he said finally, "and because leaving would mean admitting my father built something that couldn't last past his lifetime. I'm not ready to admit that." "Stubborn," Clara observed, but she was smiling. "You said it yourself, stubborn and capable." "I'm beginning to think the stubbornness outweighs the capability." Elias snorted, surprising himself with something close to laughter. "You're probably right." The line cabin at Crooked Creek was a rough structure, 1 room, a stone fireplace, bunks built into the walls, shutters that could be barred against wind and predators. Elias had stayed here dozens of times over the years, knew exactly where the previous occupants stashed firewood and where mice liked to nest in the corners. He got Clara and James settled while there was still light, showing them how to properly care for the horses in the small lean-to stable, how to hang their gear so it would stay dry, how to arrange their bedrolls for maximum warmth. James approached these lessons with the dutiful attention of a man taking notes for a report. Clara absorbed them with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she understood the why behind the what. "In the mountains, everything matters," Elias explained as he demonstrated how to build a fire that would burn steady through the night. "You get lazy about the small things will kill you. Wet socks can lead to frostbite. A poorly secured tarp can mean a sleepless night in freezing temperatures. Horses not properly tended won't have the strength to carry you when you need them most." You sound like my father, James said from where he sat organizing his surveying equipment. He used to say attention to detail was the difference between success and bankruptcy in business. Out here, it's the difference between living and dying, higher stakes. Clara had taken over fire tending, feeding small branches into the growing flames with careful precision. How did you learn all this? Just from your father? From him, from mistakes, from watching what killed other men, and making sure I didn't repeat their errors. Elias settled back against the cabin wall, accepting the cup of coffee Clara poured from the pot, now heating over the fire. The mountains are good teachers if you're willing to listen. Harsh, but good. And lonely, Clara said softly. Don't they get lonely? Mountains don't feel loneliness, they just are. I meant you. The directness of it caught Elias off guard. He sipped his coffee, using the moment to construct some deflection, some way to redirect the conversation away from himself. But Clara waited with patient expectation, and something about the firelit cabin, the isolation from town and obligations, loosened his tongue. Lonely implies wanting something different, he heard himself say. I've made peace with solitude. Have you? Or have you just convinced yourself that peace and resignation are the same thing? James looked up from his equipment, frowning. Clara, that's rather forward. It's all right, Elias said, though he wasn't sure it was. She's not wrong to ask, and the answer is, I don't know anymore. Used to be certain. 3 winters ago, I knew exactly what I wanted. To rebuild the ranch, honor my father's work, prove I could survive what killed them. But lately, he stopped, unsure why he was confessing this to virtual strangers. Lately? Clara prompted. Lately, the silence feels different. Heavier, maybe. Elias set down his coffee cup, studying the worn wooden floor. Or maybe I'm just getting tired. Or maybe you're ready to let yourself want something more than mere survival. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning Elias wasn't prepared to examine. He stood abruptly, moving to check the shutters with more force than necessary. We should get some rest. Tomorrow's climb is going to test everyone's endurance, and I need you both sharp. Clara didn't push further, for which Elias was grateful. They settled into their bedrolls as full dark fell outside, the fire crackling cheerfully and the wind beginning to pick up beyond the cabin walls. James fell asleep quickly, his snoring soon filling the small space. But Elias lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams and trying not to think about Clara's questions or the uncomfortable truth they'd stirred up, trying not to notice the sound of her breathing in the darkness, steady and calm, trying not to wonder what it said about his 3 years of chosen isolation that 2 days in her company had already begun to crack the walls he'd so carefully constructed. When he finally slept, his dreams were full of voices he'd thought he'd forgotten how to hear. Morning brought the weather Elias's instincts had warned him about. The sky had that yellowish cast that meant snow, and the wind carried the peculiar electric smell of a serious storm building. He stood outside the cabin in the pre-dawn darkness, reading the signs with a tracker's eye, calculating risks and distances. They could turn back. Probably should turn back. The smart move would be to return to Pine Creek, wait out whatever was coming in the safety of town, try again when conditions improved. But $200 was $200, and James Whitford was paying for results, not caution. And if Elias was honest with himself, which he tried not to be, part of him didn't want to cut short these days with Clara, didn't want to return to the empty ranch and emptier silence quite yet. Bad? Clara's voice came from the cabin doorway. She'd wrapped a blanket around her shoulders against the cold, her hair loose around her face in a way that did unfortunate things to Elias's concentration. Could be. Storm's building. Might pass north of us, might not. She came to stand beside him, tilting her face to the wind the way she had that first day in Pine Creek. What does your gut tell you? My gut says go back to town. But your uncle's paying me to get him to those timber stands, and I've navigated worse than this. Elias glanced at her. You scared? Nervous, she admitted, but not scared. There's a difference. Smart people are nervous in the mountains. It's the fearless ones who die. They roused James and broke camp with efficient speed, loading the pack horses and setting out as the first gray light filtered through the clouds. The trail climbed steadily now, switchbacking up slopes where snow lay deep and treacherous. Elias led them carefully, testing each section before committing the horses, watching for signs of instability. The first timber stand James wanted to survey was another 6 hours' ride, tucked into a valley where his maps suggested old-growth pine might still be standing. They made slow progress, the horses laboring through drifts, the wind picking up as they gained elevation. Clara never complained, never asked for rest stops beyond what Elias scheduled for the animals. She rode with grim determination, her face pale with cold, but her seat steady. James struggled more, his Eastern sensibilities ill-suited to the brutal reality of mountain travel, but he too persevered without protest. By noon they'd reached the valley James sought. The timber was there as promised, massive pines that had been growing when this territory was still wilderness, untouched by saw or axe. James dismounted with visible relief, pulling out his surveying tools and notebook with hands clumsy from cold. "I need about 2 hours to properly assess the stand and make my measurements," he said. "Is there shelter nearby where Clara might warm up?" Elias pointed to a rock outcropping that offered some protection from the wind. "Not much, but better than open ground. I'll get a fire started." While James worked, moving among the trees with professional focus, Elias built up a fire in the lee of the rocks and set coffee to boil. Clara sat close to the flames, her gloved hands wrapped around the warm cup he offered, and they fell into the kind of comfortable silence that Elias had thought only came with long acquaintance. "He's been planning this for 2 years, Clara said eventually, watching her uncle measure trunk diameters. "The company wants to expand west, and Uncle James convinced them that Montana timber could be harvested sustainably if done correctly. That's a nice theory. Reality tends to be clear-cutting and maximizing profit, which is why he's here personally, to make sure the survey is accurate." She sipped her coffee. "He's a good man, stubborn, detail-oriented to a fault, but genuinely committed to doing things right. Runs in the family, I'm guessing." Clara smiled. "The stubbornness? Yes, that's definitely genetic." Her expression grew more serious. "I wasn't supposed to come on this trip. My parents thought it was improper, dangerous, unsuitable for an unmarried woman. We had terrible arguments about it." "Why did you come then?" "Because I'm tired of suitable." The words came out fierce, passionate. "I'm tired of drawing room conversations and needlepoint and the endless parade of appropriate young men my mother invites to dinner. I'm tired of being decorative when I could be useful, of being protected when I want to be challenged." Elias studied her across the fire, seeing past the refined manners to the steel underneath. "Your family must have been furious. My father threatened to disinherit me. My mother cried. My younger brother said I was being selfish and foolish." Clara met his gaze steadily. "And I came anyway, because at some point you have to choose between the life you're supposed to want and the life you actually want." "And which life is this?" "I'm still figuring that out, but I know it includes mountains and challenges and feeling like I'm testing myself against something real." She paused. "Does that sound insane?" "Sounds honest." "Uncle James thinks I'm running away from something. Maybe I am. Or maybe I'm running toward something I haven't found yet." Before Elias could respond, before he could examine too closely why his chest felt tight hearing her talk about staying west, a sound cut through the air that turned his blood to ice. A deep, resonant crack, like the world itself breaking, echoing across the valley. He was on his feet instantly, scanning the ridgeline above them. "James, get back here now!" The timber merchant looked up, confused. "I'm not finished. Now!" Elias's voice cracked like a whip. He'd heard that sound before, knew exactly what it meant. "Clara, get the horses back into the trees, as far back as you can." She didn't question, didn't hesitate. She grabbed the leads and hauled the horses toward the densest section of forest, while Elias sprinted toward James, whose confusion was turning to alarm as the sound grew louder, more ominous. "What is that?" James called out. "Avalanche!" Elias reached the older man and grabbed his arm, yanking him away from the surveying equipment. "Move!" The world became noise and motion. The entire mountainside above them seemed to be sliding, a massive wall of snow and ice thundering down the slope with the inexorable force of an earthquake. Elias dragged James toward the rocks, toward any shelter they could reach, knowing even as he ran that they weren't going to make it, that the avalanche was too close, too fast, too massive. Then Clara was there, appearing from the trees on Patience, the mare's eyes white with fear but responding to her rider's demands. She kicked free of the stirrup, extending her arm. "Get on!" she screamed over the roar. Elias shoved James toward the horse. "You first." "No time." Clara's face was set with determination. "Both of you, or none of us?" There was no time to argue. Elias practically threw James onto the horse behind Clara, then grabbed the saddle horn and swung up behind them both. Patience staggered under the triple weight, and Elias had a split second to appreciate the mare's courage before Clara drove her heels in and sent the horse plunging forward. They ran before the avalanche, the horse carrying 3 riders in a desperate race against physics and death. Snow spray filled the air behind them, the sound deafening. Elias wrapped one arm around James to keep him from falling, his other hand gripping Clara's shoulder, and felt the precise moment when Patience stumbled. The mare caught herself, her training and heart overcoming her terror, and lunged forward into the tree line just as the avalanche reached them. Snow slammed into the forest, filling the spaces between trees, knocking down smaller pines like matchsticks. A wall of white rushed past them on either side, and then they were through, somehow, miraculously still mounted and still breathing. Patience collapsed to her knees in the deeper snow, sides heaving. They tumbled off in a graceless heap, and for a long moment nobody moved, everybody too shocked by survival to do anything but gulp air and shake. "Jesus Christ," James finally managed, his voice raw. "Jesus Christ, we almost—" But we didn't. Clara was laughing, a slightly hysterical edge to it. "We didn't. We're alive. We made it." Elias grabbed her shoulders, turning her to face him, needing to see with his own eyes that she was whole and unhurt. Her hat was gone, her hair wild around her face, her cheeks flushed with cold and adrenaline and something that might have been exhilaration. "That was the most foolish, brave, insane thing I've ever seen anyone do," he said, his voice rough. "You could have been killed. So could you." Her hands came up to grip his forearms, her fingers tight, even through the layers of coat and gloves. "You were going to let yourself get buried to save my uncle. That's my job. And apparently risking my life to save both of you is mine." She was still smiling, that wild, fierce smile that made Elias's heart do complicated things in his chest. "We're alive, Elias. All of us. That's what matters." He should let go of her, should step back, reestablish proper distance, remember she was a client and this was business. But her gray eyes were bright with life. Her breath came fast with the thrill of survival, and Elias found he couldn't make himself move away. "You're extraordinary," he heard himself say. "Absolutely extraordinary." Something shifted in her expression, the laughter fading into something deeper, more serious. "So are you." "I hate to interrupt," James said from where he still sat in the snow, "but what the hell do we do now?" The practical question broke the moment. Elias forced himself to release Clara and assess their situation. The avalanche had buried the valley they'd been surveying, along with James's equipment and any chance of completing that portion of the timber assessment. The path they'd taken to reach this valley was now impassable, blocked by tons of snow and debris. "We can't go back the way we came," Elias said, thinking fast. "And we can't stay here. This is avalanche country now, unstable. We need to find shelter and wait out the storm that's coming." "Where?" Clara had recovered her composure, was already moving to check Patience for injuries. "There's another line cabin about 3 hours north of here, remote but solid. We can shelter there until conditions improve, then reassess our route." "I've lost my equipment," James said, finally climbing to his feet. "The entire purpose of this expedition. The purpose right now is staying alive." Elias cut him off, more sharply than he intended. "Equipment can be replaced. We can't. We get to shelter, we survive the storm, and then we figure out next steps." James looked like he wanted to argue, but Clara laid a hand on his arm. "He's right, Uncle James. We're lucky to be breathing. The rest can wait." They gathered what they could salvage. The horses had scattered during the chaos, but were well-trained enough to come when called. 2 of the pack horses had made it clear. The other 2 were nowhere to be found, presumably buried or fled. They'd lost half their supplies, James's surveying tools, and their planned route. But they were alive, and as Elias led them north toward the distant cabin, he found himself acutely aware of every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of existence in a way he hadn't been in 3 years. Death had brushed past them close enough to feel, and in its wake, the world seemed sharper, more vivid, more precious. Clara rode beside him, and when their eyes met across the space between their horses, Elias saw his own realization reflected back at him. They'd survived together. They'd faced death and come through it intact. And something had been forged in that crucible that couldn't easily be undone. The cabin was exactly where Elias remembered it. A small structure tucked against a cliff face, built by trappers decades ago and maintained by whoever happened to need it. By the time they reached it, full dark had fallen and the snow had begun in earnest, thick flakes that promised the serious storm Elias had been expecting. Getting the horses settled, the fire built, their remaining supplies organized, it all took on the heightened focus of necessity. Nobody spoke much beyond essential communication. They were cold, exhausted, running on adrenaline and the last reserves of strength. But once the fire was burning and they'd eaten a spare meal of hardtack and dried meat, once the immediate needs of survival had been met, James Whitford cleared his throat with the air of a man who'd been thinking hard about something difficult. "Mr. Ward, Elias, I owe you an apology, and probably my life." Elias looked up from the fire, surprised. "No apology needed." "There is, though. I hired you because you were recommended as capable, but I didn't truly listen when you warned me about the dangers. I treated this as a business venture, not a potentially fatal endeavor. That was arrogant and foolish." "You weren't the one who read the snow conditions wrong," Elias said quietly. "I should have turned us back this morning when I saw the weather building. I gambled with your lives because—" He stopped, unwilling to admit that money and Clara's presence had clouded his judgment. "Because I was paying you handsomely and expecting results." James shook his head. "We're both at fault, but Clara deserves neither blame nor apology. She saved us both, and I'll not forget it." Clara had been quiet through this exchange, tending to her wet boots by the fire. Now she looked up with a slight smile. "Can we agree that we all made choices? We all survived? And we're all hopefully wiser for it?" "Wisely said." James settled back against his bedroll. "Though this does complicate our plans considerably. I need those surveys completed, but I'm not willing to risk lives for timber assessments." "There might be another way," Elias heard himself offer. "The eastern approaches to those stands are less avalanche-prone. It'll take longer to reach them, maybe add a week to the trip, but it's safer. And there's a trading post 3 days from here where we can resupply, replace your equipment." James considered this. "You'd be willing to extend the expedition, even after today. If you're willing to pay for the extra time and trust my judgment on routes from here forward." "I think today proved your judgment is sound, even when we don't follow it promptly enough." James extended his hand. "Another week, then. Same terms." They shook on it, and Elias tried not to notice the way Clara watched the exchange, something that might have been relief flickering across her face. The practical matter settled, they arranged their bedrolls for the night, the small cabin already warm from the fire. The storm outside intensified, wind howling around the cabin's corners, and snow piling against the shuttered windows. Inside, firelight flickered across rough wooden walls, and the 3 survivors of an avalanche who'd found unexpected shelter. James fell asleep quickly again, exhausted by the day's exertions and the shock of near death. But Elias lay awake, too aware of Clara across the cabin, too full of thoughts he couldn't quiet. "Are you asleep?" Her whisper barely carried over the fire's crackle. "No. I keep seeing it, the avalanche, the snow rushing toward us, the certainty that we were going to die." Elias turned his head to find her looking at him across the distance, her face half-shadow in the firelight. "First time you've been that close to death?" "Yes, it's—" She paused, searching for words. "It's clarifying. I keep thinking about all the things I was afraid to want, afraid to ask for because they weren't proper or safe or what was expected. And I think, what a waste. What a terrible waste to be given life and spend it being afraid to actually live it. And now? Now I want to stop being afraid." Her voice was steady, certain. "I want to choose the hard, beautiful things over the easy, empty ones. I want to feel this alive all the time, not just when death reminds me to." Elias understood exactly what she meant, felt it in his own bones. The way survival sharpened everything, made the warm cabin and the sound of her breathing and the simple fact of existence almost painfully precious. "That's a dangerous way to think," he said quietly. "Is it? Or is it the only honest way to think once you've seen how quickly it can all end? Before Elias could answer, before he could examine what it meant that this Eastern woman understood things he'd spent 3 years trying to forget, Clara spoke again. "Thank you for getting us through today, for knowing what to do when I was too terrified to think. You weren't too terrified to ride back for us. That wasn't bravery. That was refusing to watch you die." Something in her voice made Elias's breath catch. "I've only known you a handful of days, but I think some people you recognize immediately, like your soul knows them even when your mind is still catching up." The confession hung in the air between them, honest and raw and impossible to dismiss. Elias knew he should deflect it, make light of it, protect them both from the implications. Instead, he heard himself say, "I know what you mean." Clara's sharp intake of breath was audible even over the storm. "Do you? You stepped off that stagecoach and everything I thought I'd made peace with stopped making sense." The words came easier in the darkness, with the fire between them and the storm providing cover. 3 years I've been alone, told myself I preferred it that way. Then you show up talking about mountains and challenges and choosing the life you actually want, and suddenly solitude feels like cowardice instead of choice. It's not cowardice to protect yourself from pain, isn't it? If I'm so busy protecting myself that I forget how to actually live? Elias sat up, raking a hand through his hair. "I don't know what I'm saying. Today scrambled my thoughts. I think today clarified them." Clara's silhouette shifted as she rose, moving around the fire to sit closer to him, though still maintaining proper distance. "I think we both know what's happening here, and we're both terrified of it. You should be terrified. I'm a broke Montana rancher with nothing to offer but hard work and harder winters. You're meant for better than that." Meant by whom? My parents? Society? Some arbitrary standard of what my life should look like? She shook her head. "I'm tired of meant to be. I want could be, and I think you and I could be something extraordinary if we're brave enough to try." Elias looked at her, really looked at her, this Eastern woman who'd ridden into an avalanche to save him, who smiled at winter storms and asked uncomfortable questions and saw possibilities where he'd only seen endings. The smart thing would be to shut this down, to explain all the reasons why they came from different worlds and wanted different things. But looking at Clara in the firelight, having survived death together and found shelter together and confessed truths together, Elias couldn't make himself be smart. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "It's been 3 years since I let myself care about anyone. I'm not sure I remember how." "Then we'll figure it out together." Clara's hand found his across the space between them, her fingers threading through his with perfect certainty. "One day at a time, one truth at a time. No promises beyond tomorrow, no expectations except honesty. Can you do that?" Her hand was warm in his, solid and real, an anchor to something beyond solitude and survival. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, everything had shifted into new alignment, and Elias found he couldn't regret it. "I can try," he said, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "That's all I've got to offer, trying." "Then that's enough." Clara squeezed his hand once, then released it, moving back to her bedroll with a soft smile. "Get some sleep, Elias Ward. Tomorrow we start figuring out what comes next." He lay back down, but sleep took a long time coming. The storm howled outside while the fire burned low, and Elias stared at the ceiling beams thinking about avalanches and Eastern women, and the way a single moment could change everything you thought you knew about your own heart. The storm lasted 3 days, trapping them in the line cabin with nothing but time and each other's company. On the first day, they rested and recovered, letting exhaustion drain away while the wind shrieked outside and snow piled against the walls. On the second day, James organized what remained of his notes and attempted to salvage his plans while Clara and Elias maintained the fire and saw to the horses. On the third day, the forced intimacy of close quarters began to wear on all of them, cabin fever setting in as restlessness replaced relief. But through it all, something had fundamentally shifted between Elias and Clara. They didn't speak again of the confessions exchanged that first night, didn't acknowledge openly what had passed between them. But it was there in every exchanged glance, every accidental touch, every conversation that lasted longer than necessary. James noticed, of course. The man wasn't blind, but he kept his observations to himself. watching them both with an expression Elias couldn't quite read. When the storm finally broke on the fourth morning, the world outside had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. Snow lay pristine and deep, smoothing every rough edge, making the mountains look almost gentle in their winter dress. The sky had cleared to that crystalline blue that only came after serious weather, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. "We can move today," Elias announced over breakfast, studying the conditions through the cabin's small window. "The trading post is 2 days' hard ride from here. We'll need to break trail most of the way, which will slow us down, but the horses have rested and we've got enough supplies to make it." "And from the trading post?" James asked, wrapping his hands around his coffee cup. "From there we can reach the eastern timber stands safely. Add another 5 days to survey them properly, 3 days back to Pine Creek. 2 weeks total if weather cooperates." James nodded slowly, and Elias saw the exact moment when the timber merchant made his decision. "I need to be honest with both of you. The avalanche destroyed most of my surveying equipment, and while I can replace some of it at the trading post, I won't have the precision instruments necessary for a complete assessment. I can make rough estimates, get general counts and measurements, but it won't be the thorough survey I'd planned." "So we turn back?" Clara's voice held disappointment. "No. We continue, but with adjusted expectations. Rough estimates are better than nothing, and I can always mount a second expedition in spring with proper equipment." James set down his cup and looked directly at Elias. "Assuming, of course, that you'd be willing to guide again. Spring's different from winter. Less deadly, more predictable." "I'll take that as a yes." Something that might have been amusement flickered across James's face. "And perhaps by then you'll have sorted out whatever's developing between you and my niece." The bluntness of it caught them both off guard. Claire's cup stopped halfway to her mouth, and Elias felt heat rise in his face despite the cold cabin. "Uncle James," Clara began, "I'm not blind, my dear. And I'm not a fool." James stood, moving to gather his gear with deliberate casualness. "You're both adults, and after what we survived together, I'd be churlish to pretend I don't see what's plainly in front of me. I'm simply asking that you remember Clara is my brother's daughter, and that she has family and obligations back east, and that whatever this is needs to be approached with care and consideration, for both your sakes." Elias met the older man's gaze steadily. "I have no intentions that aren't honorable, sir." "I believe you. But honorable intentions don't always lead to happy outcomes when two people come from such different worlds." James pulled on his coat. "I'll see to the horses. Give you two a moment to discuss things properly." He left, closing the cabin door firmly behind him, and suddenly the space felt too small and too quiet. Clara was looking at Elias with an expression caught between embarrassment and something that might have been hope. "I should apologize," she said finally. "This is my fault. I shouldn't have been so forward that first night. Shouldn't have pushed—" "Don't." Elias crossed the cabin in 2 strides, stopping close enough that he could see the flecks of darker gray in her eyes. "Don't apologize for honesty. And don't pretend you didn't mean what you said, because I know you did. I know because I meant what I said too." "Then what do we do?" "Because Uncle James is right. We come from different worlds. You have your ranch, your life here. I have obligations, family expectations, a life I'm supposed to return to." "Supposed to." Elias caught the phrase. "But not one you want to return to." Clara looked away, but not before he saw the truth in her face. "It's not that simple." "It is that simple. Either you want to go back or you don't." "And if I don't? Then what?" She turned to face him again, and now there was fire in her eyes along with the uncertainty. "I stay here and do what? Become a rancher's wife? Learn to survive Montana winters? Give up everything I've ever known on the chance that this feeling between us is real and lasting? I'm not asking you to do any of that. Aren't you? Because that's what it would mean, Elias. If I choose this, if I choose you, it's not a small decision. It's not a brief adventure I can return from when the excitement wears off. It's permanent, irrevocable, and it would break my parents' hearts." The pain in her voice told Elias how much she'd already thought about this, how many times she'd worked through the implications in her own mind. He wanted to argue, to tell her it didn't have to be so extreme, that they could find some middle ground. But James was right. They came from different worlds, and bridging that gap required more than attraction and shared survival. Your uncle said we needed to approach this with care and consideration, Elias said slowly. So let's do that. Let's finish this expedition, get you both safely back to Pine Creek, and then take time to think clearly. No decisions made in the aftermath of avalanches or in storm-trapped cabins. Just honest evaluation of what this is and what it could be. Clara studied his face for a long moment. You're trying to give me an out, a way to leave without guilt or regret. I'm trying to make sure that if you stay, it's because you genuinely want this life, not because you got caught up in the romance of surviving danger together. Elias reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear in a gesture more intimate than he'd intended. I've spent 3 years alone, Clara. I can spend 3 more if I have to, but I won't trap you in a life you'll come to resent, won't be the reason you lose your family or your future. What if you are my future? The quiet certainty in her voice undid something in Elias's chest. Then 3 weeks won't change that. And if I'm not, if this is just adventure and infatuation, then you deserve the chance to discover that before you make irreversible choices. Claire's hand came up to cover his where it still rested near her face. You're a better man than you give yourself credit for, Elias Ward. Or a more cowardly one. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. It's not cowardice to want me to be certain. She turned her face slightly, pressing her cheek into his palm. But know this, I'm already more certain than you think. The question isn't whether I want this. It's whether I'm brave enough to take it. Before Elias could respond, before he could examine what it meant that her touch felt like coming home, the cabin door opened and James returned with an armload of firewood and a carefully neutral expression. Horses are ready when you are, he announced. And I do believe this weather is going to hold. Beautiful day for traveling. They packed up in relative silence, the cabin's warmth already fading as they prepared to face the cold again. But there was a new understanding between them now, unspoken but solid. They would finish what they'd started, complete the expedition properly, and then face the larger questions that neither of them was quite ready to answer. The ride to the trading post tested every bit of Elias's mountain knowledge. Breaking trail through snow that sometimes reached the horses' chests, navigating by landmarks half buried in white, constantly assessing the stability of slopes that might conceal another avalanche. It was exhausting, dangerous work that required complete focus, which was almost a relief because it left no energy for dwelling on complications or what-ifs. Clara proved herself again and again over those 2 days. She never complained about the cold or the pace or the difficulty. When her horse foundered in a drift, she dismounted and led the animal through on foot without being asked. When they needed to traverse a particularly treacherous slope, she followed Elias's instructions with steady nerves and capable hands. She was, Elias realized, exactly what she'd claimed to be. Someone who wanted to be tested, challenged, proven against something real. They reached the trading post late on the second day, a rough collection of buildings clustered in a valley where trappers and prospectors came to resupply and trade pelts for necessities. The post was run by a French-Canadian named Jacques Renaud and his Salish wife Marie, who greeted their unexpected guests with the casual hospitality of people who'd learned not to question why anyone appeared at their door in winter. Mon ami! Jacques clapped Elias on the shoulder with genuine warmth. 3 years since we see you last. We hear about your family. Très triste, very sad. We pray for you. Appreciate it, Jacques. Elias gestured to his companions. James Whitford and his niece Clara, Timber Survey Expedition. Marie's dark eyes swept over Clara with the assessing gaze of one frontier woman evaluating another. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she smiled and extended her hand. You are welcome. Come. I have stew warm and bread fresh. You all look like you need feeding. The trading post's main building was part general store, part tavern, part home, with a huge stone fireplace at one end and sleeping lofts at the other. 3 other travelers were already there, 2 trappers heading back to Fort Benton with their winter catch, and a prospector who'd given up on his claim and was making his way south before the mountains became completely impassable. Over Marie's excellent stew and Jacques' potent whiskey, stories were exchanged. The trappers spoke of the hard winter, animals scarce, and pelts thin. The prospector complained about played-out creeks, and the foolishness of men who still believed in easy gold. James explained his timber survey, though he left out the details of the avalanche, and Clara deflected questions about what an Eastern lady was doing in the Montana wilderness with graceful vagueness. Elias mostly listened, content to let the others carry the conversation while he planned their route for the next leg of the journey. But he was acutely aware of Clara across the room, the way firelight caught in her hair, the sound of her laugh when the trappers told an outrageous story about a confused bear. He was aware, too, of the way Marie watched them both with knowing eyes that missed nothing. When the evening wound down and sleeping arrangements were discussed, Marie pulled Elias aside while the others climbed to the lofts. "That girl," she said without preamble, her English still accented after 20 years of marriage to Jacques. "She is not what she seems." Elias stiffened. "What do you mean?" "I mean she dresses like city lady, but has eyes like someone who has seen hard things, survived hard things. And the way she looks at you—" Marie smiled, a small private smile. "That is not the look of a woman playing at adventure. That is the look of a woman who has found something worth keeping. It's complicated. Love is always complicated, but that does not make it wrong." Marie patted his arm with maternal affection. "My family did not want me to marry Jacques. Said he was rough, uneducated, not good enough for Chief's daughter, but I knew my own heart. 20 years later, I have no regrets. Her world and mine are pretty far apart. So you build a bridge, or you meet in the middle, or one of you chooses to cross." Marie's expression grew serious. "But do not make the mistake of choosing for her, eh? Women are stronger than men think. We can carry more, endure more, decide more. Trust her to know what she wants." The advice stayed with Elias as he climbed to his own sleeping loft, as he lay awake listening to the sounds of the trading post settling for the night. Trust her to know what she wants. It sounded simple, but it required surrendering control, accepting that Clara might choose differently than he'd choose for her, risking genuine heartbreak instead of the manageable loneliness he'd perfected over 3 years. The question was whether he was brave enough to do that. Morning brought renewed purpose. James purchased replacement surveying equipment from Jacques' surprisingly well-stocked store. Not the precision instruments he'd lost, but adequate for rough estimates. They resupplied their depleted stores, replaced damaged tack, and by mid-morning were ready to continue. The eastern approach to the timber stands took them through different country, still mountainous, still snow-covered, but with gentler slopes and more stable terrain. The weather held clear and cold, and they made good time, reaching the first survey location by late afternoon of the third day from the trading post. These trees were smaller than the giants the avalanche had buried, but still impressive. Old-growth pine and fir that had escaped the logger's axe through sheer remoteness. James moved among them with professional focus, measuring and recording while Clara assisted with the kind of competence that suggested she'd done this before. "You've helped with surveys," Elias observed, watching her hold the measuring tape steady while James took readings. "Every summer since I was 12, Uncle James would come visit, and I'd beg to go along on his expeditions. My parents thought it was a phase I'd outgrow." She smiled, checking the measurement before James recorded it. They were wrong. Over the next 4 days, they worked their way through all 3 remaining timber stands on James's list. It was methodical, sometimes tedious work, but Elias found himself appreciating the steady rhythm of it. There was satisfaction in watching James build his survey, in seeing Clara's easy competence with tasks she'd clearly performed many times before, in the simple accomplishment of work well done. But underneath the work, tension built. They were running out of time, out of trail, out of excuses to delay the reckoning that waited in Pine Creek. Every day brought them closer to decisions that couldn't be postponed, and Elias felt the weight of it growing heavier. Clara felt it too. He could see it in the way her gaze lingered on the mountains, in the quiet intensity with which she absorbed every detail of their journey, as if memorizing something she feared losing. They spoke less as the expedition drew toward its end, but their silence was full of unspoken words, heavy with all the things neither of them knew how to say. On their last night before beginning the 3-day ride back to Pine Creek, they camped in a protected valley where a hot spring created a pocket of relative warmth in the frozen landscape. Steam rose in ghostly columns, and the sound of water moving beneath ice provided strange music in the winter stillness. After dinner, James excused himself early, claiming exhaustion, though Elias suspected the older man was deliberately giving them privacy, which left Clara and Elias sitting by the fire, watching sparks rise toward stars so bright they looked close enough to touch. "I don't want to go back," Clara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know we agreed to think clearly, to not make decisions in the moment, but I've had days to think now and it hasn't changed anything. I don't want to go back east." Elias's heart stuttered in his chest, hope and fear warring for dominance. "Clara, let me finish." She turned to face him, and in the firelight her eyes were luminous, determined. "I know what I'm saying. I know what I'd be giving up. My family's approval, their financial support, the life they planned for me. I know it would hurt them, disappoint them, maybe damage those relationships forever. And I know what I'd be choosing instead. Hard winters, harder work, a man I've known less than 2 weeks who can't promise me anything beyond survival and honesty. Then why? Because for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The words came out fierce, passionate. "Not where someone else thinks I should be, not where society expects me, not where it's safe and proper and appropriate, but where I choose, where I want to be, where every breath feels real instead of rehearsed." Elias stood abruptly, needing to move, needing to think. He paced to the edge of the firelight and back, running his hands through his hair. "You're asking me to let you give up everything on the basis of 2 weeks in extreme circumstances. How can I do that? How can I be responsible for that kind of sacrifice?" "You're not responsible for my choices. I am." Clara stood too, closing the distance between them. "And I'm not asking your permission, Elias. I'm telling you what I've decided. What you do with that information is up to you." "What I do with it?" He almost laughed at the absurdity. "Clara, I'm falling in love with you. Have been since you stepped off that stagecoach smiling at the winter wind like it held secrets. But loving you doesn't give me the right to destroy your life. Loving me gives you the right to trust that I know my own mind." She reached up, framing his face with both hands. "I'm not fragile, Elias. I'm not some delicate flower that will wilt in the harsh Montana sun. I'm strong enough for this life. The question is whether you're strong enough to let me choose it. And your family? Will be devastated and angry and eventually, maybe, understanding." Pain flickered across her face. "I won't lie and say it doesn't terrify me, the thought of losing them. But I'm more terrified of losing myself, of going back to that life and slowly suffocating under the weight of should and ought and proper." Elias covered her hands with his own, holding them against his face, feeling the warmth of her palms through the cold night air. "I have nothing to offer you. The ranch is barely surviving. The house needs work. Winter is brutal and spring is worse, and summer brings its own challenges. You'd be working from dawn to dusk just to keep everything running. There'd be no servants, no society, no comforts you're accustomed to." "I don't want comfort. I want purpose. I want partnership. I want to build something real with someone who sees me as an equal, not a decorative addition to his life." Clara's voice softened. "I want you, Elias Ward. Stubborn, solitary, surprisingly tender you. And if you want me too, then we figure out the rest as we go. When we get back to Pine Creek, you'll see your uncle off on the stage east, and I'll ride back to the Circle W alone. You'll stay in town for a week, maybe 2. Elias spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. "You'll have time away from me, away from the mountains, time to think without the influence of proximity or recent danger. If after that time you still want this life, still want me, then we'll talk seriously about what comes next. But you need that time, Clara, for your own sake. I don't need time to know my own heart. Maybe not, but I need you to have it anyway, because if you choose this, if you choose me, I want to know beyond any doubt that it's real and lasting, and not something you'll regret come spring." He pulled her hands down but didn't release them. "Can you do that? Can you give yourself that time?" Clara searched his face for a long moment, and Elias saw her wrestle with the request, saw her want to argue, but finally she nodded. 2 weeks. I'll stay in Pine Creek for 2 weeks after Uncle James leaves. And if at the end of that time I still feel the same, and I will, Elias, I promise you I will, Then you come back to town and we have that serious conversation about what comes next. And if you change your mind, I won't. But if you do, I'll understand. No blame, no hard feelings, just acceptance that we wanted different things. The lie tasted bitter on his tongue because he knew damn well there would be hard feelings, that he'd spend the rest of his life comparing every woman to the one who got away. But he said it anyway because Clara needed to know she had that freedom. "Deal," Clara said softly. Then rising on her toes, she pressed a kiss to his cheek, her lips warm against his cold skin. "But start preparing yourself, Elias, because in 2 weeks, I'm going to make you keep your word about that serious conversation. And you're going to have to figure out if you're brave enough to accept what I'm offering." She stepped back before he could respond, before he could pull her close the way everything in him was demanding. She smiled, that fierce, bright smile he'd come to know, and turned toward her bedroll, leaving Elias standing by the fire with the phantom warmth of her kiss still burning on his skin. He didn't sleep that night, just sat by the fire, feeding wood to the flames, and tried to prepare himself for the 2 hardest weeks of his life. The ride back to Pine Creek was bittersweet. They retraced their route through country that had become familiar, past the trading post where Jacques and Marie waved them off with knowing smiles, through valleys and overpasses that Elias had traveled 100 times, but which now felt different, marked by Clara's presence in ways that would linger long after she was gone. James was satisfied with his rough survey, already making notes for the spring expedition that would complete the work properly. He spoke enthusiastically about the timber quality, the accessibility of the stands, the potential for sustainable harvest. But his eyes kept finding Elias and Clara, and Elias knew the older man was thinking about more than timber logistics. On the last day, as Pine Creek's buildings came into view in the distance, James rode up beside Elias while Clara had dropped back to adjust a packhorse's load. "I need to know your intentions," James said without preamble. "Not because I doubt your honor, but because Clara is my responsibility until she chooses otherwise, and I need to understand what I'm returning to face when I go back east. We've agreed she'll take 2 weeks in town to think clearly about what she wants. After that, if she still feels the same, we'll talk seriously about a future." James nodded slowly. "And if she chooses to stay, if she chooses you, then I'll spend the rest of my life making sure she never regrets it." "That's what I hoped you'd say." James was quiet for a moment, then added, "You should know, her father is a formidable man, wealthy, influential, accustomed to getting his way. If Clara defies him on this, there will be consequences. He'll likely cut her off financially, may even refuse to acknowledge her, and her mother, while gentler, will be heartbroken." "I know." "Do you? Because it's easy to say you'll weather those consequences, harder to actually live with them. Clara would be giving up not just comfort in society, but family connection, inheritance, everything she's ever known. That's a heavy burden for any relationship to carry. Which is why she needs the 2 weeks, to be sure she can carry it." James studied Elias with sharp eyes. "You're hoping she'll change her mind." "I'm hoping she'll make the right choice for herself, whatever that is." Elias met the older man's gaze steadily. "I won't lie and say it won't destroy me if she leaves, but I'd rather be destroyed than be responsible for her destroying herself by staying. You're a rare man, Elias Ward. Stubborn and solitary, as my niece said, but with more integrity than most." James extended his hand. "Whatever Clara decides, you have my respect. And if she does choose to stay, you have my blessing, for whatever that's worth." They shook on it, and Elias felt some of the weight lift from his chest. He wouldn't have James Whitford's money or business connections or social standing to offer Clara, but he'd have the old man's blessing, which counted for something. Pine Creek appeared unchanged by their absence, still the same rough collection of buildings huddled against the winter. Still the same curious faces appearing in windows as they rode up the main street. But to Elias, everything felt different. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a solitary rancher content with his isolation. Now he was a man in love, terrified and hopeful in equal measure, riding toward a reckoning he couldn't predict or control. They stopped at the hotel, where Mrs. Chen came bustling out with hot coffee and welcome home greetings. Doc Brennan appeared from his office across the street, and old Murphy from the general store, both wanting to hear about the expedition and express relief that they'd all returned safely. While James handled the logistics of settling their bill and arranging his departure on the next stage, Elias helped Clara with her horse, both of them moving slowly, reluctant to acknowledge that this was goodbye, at least temporarily. 2 weeks, Clara said, her hand resting on Patience's neck. 2 weeks, Elias confirmed. Stay at the hotel, get warm, rest up. Talk to folks in town if you want. Get a sense of what life here is really like outside of mountain expeditions. Trying to scare me off? Trying to make sure you know what you're getting into. He allowed himself to touch her face one more time, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. Clara, don't. She caught his hand, holding it against her face. Don't say goodbye like you think it's permanent. I'll see you in 2 weeks, Elias. Count on it. I'm counting on you being happy, whatever that takes. She smiled, but there were tears in her eyes. Stubborn, solitary, surprisingly tender man. I'll miss you. I'll miss you too. James emerged from the hotel then, and it was time. Elias stepped back, putting proper distance between himself and Clara, becoming just the hired guide again in front of the town's watching eyes. He shook James's hand one final time, accepted payment for services rendered, and mounted his horse with the mechanical efficiency of long practice. He didn't look back as he rode out of Pine Creek, didn't trust himself to see Clara standing in front of the hotel without turning around and demanding she make her decision right then and there. Instead, he focused on the familiar trail home, on the ranch waiting for him, on the 2 weeks of solitude that stretched ahead like a prison sentence. The Circle W looked exactly as he'd left it, snow-covered, silent, bearing the marks of one man's insufficient attention. Elias went through the motions of settling back in, caring for the horses, checking on cattle, rebuilding fires in a cold house. But his mind was in Pine Creek, wondering what Clara was doing, whether she was already regretting her bold declarations, whether 2 weeks would prove too long or not long enough. He lasted 3 days before he broke. On the 4th morning after returning home, Elias woke before dawn with absolute clarity about what he needed to do. He'd been wrong to ask Clara to wait, wrong to demand time for consideration when his own heart was already decided. Wrong to hide behind noble-sounding concerns about her welfare when really he was just afraid. Afraid of wanting something again, afraid of losing it, afraid of the vulnerability that came with love. Marie had been right. Trust her to know what she wants. And Clara had been right too. He needed to be brave enough to accept what she was offering instead of finding reasons to refuse it. Elias dressed with shaking hands, suddenly desperate to get back to town, to tell Clara he'd been a fool, to ask if her offer still stood. But as he reached for his coat, he heard horses approaching, multiple horses, moving fast. He stepped onto the porch to find half of Pine Creek riding up his lane. Doc Brennan led the group, his face grave, and behind him came Tommy Chen, Mrs. Henderson, Old Murphy, and a dozen others. Elias, Doc said, swinging down from his horse, we need to talk to you about Clara Whitford. Elias's heart stopped. What happened? Is she hurt? Not hurt, but her uncle's gone, caught yesterday's stage back east, and Clara's announced she's staying in Pine Creek, permanently. Doc's expression was serious, but not unsympathetic. The whole town's been talking about nothing else. She's made it clear she's staying because of you, and folks have opinions about what that means. What kind of opinions? The kind that say you need to do right by her. Old Murphy stepped forward, his weathered face stern. Now, we all know you're a good man, Elias, but that girl has given up everything to stay here. And if you're not prepared to make an honest woman of her, then you need to say so now so she can make other arrangements. Elias felt like he'd been punched. She wasn't supposed to decide yet. We agreed on 2 weeks. Well, she decided anyway, made a formal announcement yesterday that she's staying, got herself a job helping Mrs. Henderson at the school 3 days a week, and rented the room above the mercantile. Doc crossed his arms. So the question is, what are you going to do about it? What was he going to do? Elias looked at the assembled townspeople, at their concerned faces and their demand for answers, and felt laughter building in his chest, slightly hysterical laughter, born of relief and terror and overwhelming love for a woman stubborn enough to ignore his careful plans and brave enough to choose what she wanted without waiting for permission. I'm going to town, he said, right now, and I'm going to ask Clara Whitford to marry me. assuming she hasn't already changed her mind about wanting a stubborn fool for a husband. Doc Brennan's stern expression cracked into a grin. Now, that's what we came to hear. Mrs. Henderson, you owe me $5. Damn it, Mrs. Henderson muttered, but she was smiling too. I bet you'd take the full 2 weeks to grow a spine. Elias barely heard them. He was already moving, saddling his horse with hands that wouldn't stay steady, his heart pounding so hard he could barely breathe. Clara had chosen. Against all his noble intentions and careful reasoning, she'd chosen him, chosen this life, chosen permanent over provisional and certainty over safety. And now it was his turn to be brave enough to accept it. He rode for Pine Creek like the devil himself was chasing him, arrived in town at full gallop with half the countryside trailing behind him, and found Clara exactly where he'd feared and hoped, standing in the street in front of the hotel, her face pale but determined, waiting. She saw him coming and her expression transformed, fear giving way to joy, giving way to something that looked almost like relief. Elias didn't dismount so much as fall off his horse, stumbling toward her while the entire town gathered to watch. You weren't supposed to decide yet, he said when he reached her. I know. We agreed on 2 weeks. We did. You're supposed to be thinking clearly, away from my influence, making sure this is really what you want. I am sure. I was sure 3 days ago, and I'm sure now, and I'll be sure 2 weeks from now and 20 years from now. Clara's hands came up to grip his coat. I sent a letter to my parents, told them I'm staying, told them about you, told them I love them, but I'm choosing this life anyway. It's done, Elias. I've made my choice, and I'm not changing my mind. Your family will be devastated and furious and eventually, I hope, forgiving. But that's my burden to carry, not yours. Her gray eyes searched his face. The only question that matters now is whether you still want me. Because I'm staying in Pine Creek either way. I've got a job, a room, a new life starting, but I'd very much prefer to start it with you. Elias couldn't speak past the tightness in his throat. Instead, he dropped to one knee right there in the frozen street, with half of Pine Creek watching and Clara's hand still gripping his coat. Clara Whitford, I have nothing to offer you but hard work and harder winters, and a half-broken ranch that needs more attention than one man can give it. I'm stubborn and solitary, and apparently surprisingly tender. And I don't deserve you, but I love you more than I thought I could love anything after 3 years of choosing not to feel. The words tumbled out rough and honest. Will you marry me anyway? Will you take a chance on building something real and lasting out of 2 weeks of shared danger and a Christmas wish I never dared to make out loud? Clara was crying now, tears streaming down her face even as she smiled. Yes, yes, absolutely yes, you stubborn fool. I'll marry you and build a life with you and learn to survive Montana winters with you, and we'll figure out the rest as we go. He stood, pulling her into his arms, and kissed her there in the street while Pine Creek erupted in cheers and applause. She kissed him back with fierce joy, her cold hands framing his face, her tears wet against his cheeks, and Elias felt something in his chest unlock that had been frozen for 3 long years. When they finally broke apart, breathless and laughing, Doc Brennan was wiping his eyes, and Mrs. Henderson was beaming, and old Murphy was already calculating how much ribbon and lace he could sell for a wedding. We should talk about details, Clara said, still wrapped in Elias's arms, about when and where and how. Later, Elias interrupted. Right now, I just want to hold you and believe this is actually happening. It's happening. Clara squeezed him tighter. I rode into town on a stagecoach, and I'm never leaving. Your Christmas wish came true, Elias Ward. Better get used to it. And standing there in the December cold with the woman he loved in his arms, and a future he'd stopped believing in suddenly stretching before them both, Elias thought that maybe, just maybe, he could get used to miracles after all. The practical realities of building a life together hit them almost immediately. Pine Creek might have cheered their engagement, but that didn't change the fact that Elias had a struggling ranch to run, and Clara had just committed to a life she'd only glimpsed in 2 weeks of mountain travel. The romance of their story couldn't put food on the table or repair the Circle W's sagging barn roof, or bridge the vast gap between the world Clara came from and the one she'd chosen. Mrs. Henderson, practical as ever, took charge of the immediate situation. She marched Clara and Elias into the mercantile the day after the proposal, and sat them down at the counter with the no-nonsense air of a woman who'd seen enough frontier romances founder on the rocks of poor planning. "Love is fine and good," she announced, pulling out a ledger and pencil, "but it doesn't keep you warm through February or fed through lean times. So let's talk sensibly about what comes next." Elias shifted uncomfortably on the wooden stool, unused to discussing his private business with anyone, let alone in the middle of the general store where any customer might overhear. But Clara leaned forward with genuine interest, and he realized this was part of what made her different from other Eastern women he'd known. She wanted the practical truths, not the romanticized version. "First question," Mrs. Henderson said briskly. "When's the wedding? Because Clara can't stay in that room above here indefinitely without damaging her reputation beyond repair, engaged or not." "As soon as possible," Clara said. At the same moment, Elias said, "Spring, maybe?" They looked at each other, and Elias saw the flash of hurt in Clara's eyes before she schooled her expression to neutrality. Mrs. Henderson just raised an eyebrow. "Seems like you two need to discuss that privately. But while you're discussing, consider this. Winter weddings are simple by necessity, which might suit your circumstances. Spring weddings give folks time to prepare and travel, which matters if Clara's family decides to come after all." She tapped her pencil against the ledger. "Think about it and let me know. Now, second question. Where are you living? The ranch is a good hour's ride from town, which means Clara will be isolated out there, especially in bad weather." "The ranch is my home," Elias said, hearing the defensiveness in his own voice. "Where else would we live? I'm just pointing out that your bride is accustomed to neighbors and society and having people nearby. Living alone on a ranch is different from visiting one." "I know what I'm choosing," Clara said quietly, but firmly. "I'm not afraid of isolation, Mrs. Henderson, and I'm certainly not afraid of hard work. Knowing and experiencing are different things, dear. I'm not trying to discourage you. Lord knows we need more strong women in this territory. But I'm trying to make sure you go into this with eyes open." Mrs. Henderson's expression softened. "The first winter is the hardest. The loneliness, the cold, the sheer relentless work of survival. It breaks some women. I want to make sure it doesn't break you." "It won't," Clara said with such conviction that even Mrs. Henderson looked satisfied. "I'm stronger than I look." "I believe you are. But Elias, you need to prepare yourself too. She's going to need teaching, how to manage a frontier household, preserve food, handle livestock, survive when you're away from the ranch. Are you prepared to be patient with that learning curve?" Elias looked at Clara, really looked at her, and saw not just the woman he loved, but the reality of what they were undertaking. She'd never baked bread in a wood stove, never milked a cow, never hauled water from a frozen creek or slaughtered chickens or any of the 100 daily tasks that frontier life demanded. Teaching her while also managing the ranch would take time they didn't have. Patience he wasn't sure he possessed, but he also saw the determination in her eyes, the steel underneath the silk that had let her ride into an avalanche and choose a hard life over an easy one. And he thought maybe Mrs. Henderson was underestimating both of them. "We'll figure it out," he said, "together." Mrs. Henderson studied them both for a long moment, then nodded. "All right then. I'll help where I can. Teaching Clara the domestic skills she'll need, providing supplies on credit until your next cattle sale, connecting her with the other ranch wives who can offer advice. But you two need to be honest with each other about expectations and fears and all the difficult things couples avoid talking about until it's too late." They left the mercantile with a list of priorities that felt overwhelming. Set a wedding date, prepare the ranch house for a bride, teach Clara essential skills, manage Elias's regular ranch work, and somehow find time to actually build the relationship that would sustain them through all of it. Elias walked Clara back to her room, acutely aware of the curious eyes watching them from windows and doorways. "I'm sorry," he said when they reached the external stairs leading to her quarters, "about suggesting we wait until spring. I wasn't trying to delay. I just wanted to give me more time to change my mind." Clara's voice was gentle, not accusatory. "Elias, I understand your caution. I even appreciate it. But I need you to understand that every day we wait is another day I'm living in limbo. Not quite part of your life, not quite independent, just existing in this strange, in-between space. You're right, I'm being a coward again. Not a coward, careful, There's a difference. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers cool against his jaw. But I don't need careful right now. I need commitment. I need to know that you're as certain about this as I am. I am certain. I'm terrified and uncertain about 1,000 details, but I'm absolutely certain that I want to spend my life with you. Elias covered her hand with his. 2 weeks from tomorrow. That gives us time to prepare the ranch house, for Doc Brennan to file the necessary paperwork, for you to learn at least the basics from Mrs. Henderson. 2 weeks, and then you're my wife and we figure out the rest as we go. Clara's smile was radiant. 2 weeks from tomorrow. I'll hold you to that, Elias Ward. They sealed the promise with a kiss that made the watching townsfolk smile and whisper, and when Elias finally rode back to the Circle W that evening, it was with a heart lighter than it had been in years and a to-do list that would have daunted a less motivated man. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of frantic activity. Elias threw himself into preparing the ranch house with an energy born of equal parts love and terror. He scrubbed floors that hadn't been properly cleaned in 3 years, repaired broken windows, fixed the leak in the roof over what would be their bedroom. He hauled away 3 years' worth of accumulated bachelor mess and realized with embarrassment how much he'd let the place deteriorate. Doc Brennan rode out one afternoon and found Elias on the roof hammering new shingles, surveyed the work with an approving eye, and climbed the ladder to sit beside him. "Looking good," Doc observed. "Better than it has since before your folks passed. Had motivation before. Now I have better motivation." Elias set down his hammer, flexing fingers sore from days of constant work. "Doc, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "How do I know I'm not making a terrible mistake? Not about loving Clara, I'm certain about that, but about bringing her into this life. What if Mrs. Henderson is right and the isolation breaks her? What if she wakes up a year from now and realizes she's given up everything for a hardscrabble existence that's grinding her down?" Doc was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant on the mountains. "When I married my Sarah, 40 years ago now, her family thought I was crazy for bringing her west. She was a Boston girl, educated, refined, never worked a day in her life. But she wanted adventure, wanted to be useful, wanted to test herself against something real. Sound familiar?" "Very." "First winter was hell. She cried herself to sleep more nights than not. Burned dinner, couldn't figure out the stove, was terrified of the horses. I questioned my judgment constantly, wondered if I'd been selfish to let her come." Doc smiled, a soft, reminiscent expression. "But you know what? She was tougher than either of us gave her credit for. By the second winter, she was the one teaching other women how to survive. By the 5th winter, she was the strongest person I knew. And when she died, 10 years back, she told me she'd never regretted a single day of choosing this life over the easy one." "Clara's not Sarah." "No, but she's got that same steel in her spine, that same determination to prove herself. And more importantly, she's got you, and you've already survived what would have broken most men. Together, you'll be stronger than either of you are alone." Doc clapped him on the shoulder. "Stop borrowing trouble, Elias. Trust the choice you both made, and work like hell to make it good." The advice helped, even if it didn't completely quiet Elias's fears. He kept working, and 3 days before the wedding, he stepped back to survey the results. The house wasn't fancy, would never be fancy, but it was clean and solid and warm. He'd built up stores of firewood that would last through the worst of winter. The pantry was stocked with what supplies he could afford. Fresh curtains hung in the windows, courtesy of Mrs. Henderson, who'd enlisted Clara in making them. It looked, Elias thought with satisfaction, like a home instead of just a shelter. Meanwhile, Clara threw herself into learning with the same fierce determination she'd brought to mountain travel. She spent mornings at the schoolhouse, teaching basic reading and arithmetic to Pine Creek's handful of children, and afternoons with Mrs. Henderson learning the domestic arts that Eastern finishing schools didn't cover. She learned to bake bread that didn't come out dense as stones, to churn butter, to preserve vegetables, to manage a wood stove's temperamental heat. She also spent time with the other ranch wives, absorbing their hard-won wisdom about frontier survival. Martha Tucker, whose husband ran cattle 20 miles north, taught her to shoot and reload efficiently. Sarah Chen showed her how to butcher chickens without flinching. Emma Brennan, Doc's daughter-in-law, demonstrated the intricate process of soap making and explained the importance of maintaining cordial relations with the nearest Salish families, who could be valuable allies in emergencies. The loneliness is real, Emma told Clara one afternoon as they worked together preparing the small church for the wedding. There'll be times when Elias is out with the cattle for days on end, and you're alone with nothing but wind and silence for company. You have to make peace with that, or it'll drive you mad. How did you make peace with it? Kept busy. Read every book I could get my hands on. Learned to appreciate the silence instead of fighting it. And reminded myself daily that I chose this life because I wanted something real, even when the reality was harder than I'd imagined. Emma paused in her decorating to look at Clara seriously. You're going to have moments when you question everything, when you're exhausted and cold and missing your family and wondering if you made a terrible mistake. We all do. The key is pushing through those moments instead of letting them define you. And if I can't push through, then you come to town, stay with Mrs. Henderson or with me, take a few days to breathe and remember why you chose this. There's no shame in needing help, Clara. The women who survive out here are the ones who ask for it. Clara absorbed this wisdom gratefully, storing it away for the hard times she knew were coming. But she also felt a growing confidence in her ability to handle what lay ahead. She was learning fast, driven by genuine interest rather than obligation, and she could already see the difference it made. The bread she baked now was edible. She could load and fire a rifle accurately. She understood the rhythm of frontier work, the way each task connected to the next in an endless cycle of preparation and preservation and survival. 2 days before the wedding, her parents' response to her letter arrived. Clara sat in her rented room, hands shaking as she broke the seal, terrified of what she'd find inside. The letter was from her mother, written in the elegant script Clara knew so well. The words were painful to read. Her mother wrote of disappointment and heartbreak, of crying for days after receiving Clara's news. Her father, the letter said, had raged and then gone silent, retreating into cold anger that might never thaw. Her younger brother thought she was being selfish and dramatic. The family was humiliated by her choice, wounded by what they saw as rejection and betrayal. But buried in the pain was a thread of reluctant understanding. Her mother wrote that she remembered being young and yearning for something beyond what was offered, remembered the suffocating weight of expectations and propriety. She didn't approve of Clara's choice, couldn't condone it, but she could acknowledge that Clara had always been different, had always wanted more than the life they'd planned for her. The letter ended with a heartbreaking admission. They would not be attending the wedding, could not condone it with their presence, but they loved her still. They would leave the door open should she ever wish to return, but they could offer no financial support, no social connections, no safety net. Clara had chosen her path, and she would walk it alone. Clara wept over that letter, mourning the family connection she'd damaged, maybe destroyed. But underneath the grief was a strange sense of relief. The worst had happened. Her family knew and had responded exactly as she'd feared. And she was still standing, still certain, still ready to marry Elias and build a life in Montana despite the cost. She showed Elias the letter the next day, when he rode into town ostensibly to pick up supplies, but really just to see her. They sat in the small parlor of the hotel, the letter spread between them, and Elias read it with a deepening frown. "I'm sorry," he said when he finished. "Clara, I'm so sorry. If I'd known it would cost you this much." "You'd what? Not proposed? Not loved me?" She shook her head firmly. "No. I knew what this choice meant, Elias. I knew it would hurt them, knew they might not forgive me. And I made it anyway, because the alternative, going back to that life, giving you up, pretending I could be satisfied with what I had before, that would have cost me more. Your mother says they won't provide any financial support. I know, which means we're truly on our own, building from scratch with what we have." Clara met his eyes steadily. "Does that change anything for you? Knowing I come with no dowry, no family connections, no resources beyond what I've earned from teaching? The only thing that matters is you." Elias took her hands, threading their fingers together. "Everything else we'll figure out. Money, resources, family. We'll build what we need and make do with what we have. We've survived avalanches and winter storms. We can survive this too." "Together," Clara said softly. "Together." The wedding itself was simple by necessity and perfect by any measure that mattered. Doc Brennan had filed the necessary paperwork and would officiate, having been ordained years ago specifically for such occasions. The small church was decorated with pine boughs and whatever winter greenery the women of Pine Creek could gather. Mrs. Henderson had worked miracles altering a dress from her own trousseau to fit Clara, the ivory silk and lace transformed into something both elegant and practical. Elias stood at the front of the church in his best clothes, still rough by Eastern standards but clean and mended, his hair tamed and his boots polished to a shine. His hands shook slightly as he waited, and Doc Brennan leaned over with a quiet smile. Nervous? Terrified. What if she realizes she's making a mistake? What if she walks in here and sees this rough church and these frontier people and decides she wants better? Then she wouldn't be the woman you fell in love with. Doc squeezed his shoulder. Trust her, Elias. She knows what she's choosing. The church doors opened, and every doubt in Elias's mind evaporated. Clara stood framed in winter light, Mrs. Henderson beside her in place of the father who'd refused to come. She wore the altered dress like it had been made for her, her dark hair pinned up with wildflowers that Emma had somehow coaxed into blooming in her hothouse. But it was her face that undid Elias, radiant with joy, eyes bright with certainty, smile wide and genuine as she walked toward him. She'd chosen this, chosen him, chosen a simple church and frontier witnesses and a hard life over everything she'd known before. And looking at her, Elias felt the last of his fear dissolve into overwhelming gratitude and love. The ceremony was brief. Doc Brennan spoke about commitment and partnership, about building lives in hard country requiring both strength and flexibility. He talked about the importance of choosing each other daily, not just in this moment, but in all the moments to come. The easy ones and the difficult ones, the joyful ones and the grinding ones. When it came time for vows, Elias spoke from the heart, his voice rough with emotion. I promise to honor you as an equal partner, to listen when you speak, to value your strength as much as I cherish your softness. I promise to work beside you, to share the burdens and the joys, to never make you feel alone even in the loneliest country. And I promise to love you, not just today when everything is new and hopeful, but on the hard days too, when we're tired and tested and wondering if we can make it through. I promise to choose you, Clara, every day, every way, for the rest of my life. Clara's vows were equally heartfelt, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I promise to be brave when courage is needed, to be honest even when truth is difficult, to be strong without forgetting how to be gentle. I promise to learn what I don't know, to work without complaint, to find joy in the simple things and beauty in the hard things. And I promise to trust you, trust your judgment, your protection, your love. I chose this life, chose you, chose us, and I'll keep choosing it, Elias. Through every season, every challenge, every moment of doubt, and every moment of certainty, I'm yours, completely. When Doc Brennan pronounced them husband and wife, when Elias kissed Clara to the cheers of Pine Creek's gathered residents, it felt like more than just a wedding. It felt like a declaration, a defiance of all the voices that had said they were too different, too hasty, too foolish to make this work. It felt like the beginning of something extraordinary. The reception was held in the hotel's dining room, with food donated by every family in town and music provided by Old Murphy's surprisingly accomplished fiddle playing. It was nothing like the grand Eastern weddings Clara would have attended in her previous life. No orchestra, no champagne, no elaborate decorations, just frontier people celebrating two of their own with whatever they had to offer. But Clara seemed to treasure every moment of it. She danced with Elias, and then with Doc Brennan, and then with every man brave enough to ask. She laughed at Martha Tucker's outrageous stories and cried at Emma Brennan's heartfelt toast. She thanked Mrs. Henderson so sincerely for everything that the older woman had to turn away to hide her tears. And when the sun began to set and it was time to leave for the ranch, for home, Clara changed into traveling clothes and climbed onto Patience's back with the ease of someone who'd been riding all her life. She looked at Pine Creek gathered to see them off and said in a clear, caring voice, "Thank you, all of you, for welcoming me, teaching me, giving me a chance to prove myself. I won't let you down." "We know you won't, dear," Mrs. Henderson called back. "You're one of us now." They rode out of Pine Creek as the winter sun painted the mountains gold and pink, husband and wife heading toward a future uncertain in its details but solid in its foundation. The Circle W waited for them, and as they crested the final rise and the ranch came into view, Elias felt Clara's sharp intake of breath. "You've been working," she said, taking in the repaired buildings, the neat yard, the smoke rising from the chimney where he'd banked a fire that morning. "Wanted it to be ready for you. For us. It's perfect." She urged Patience forward, and Elias followed, watching as his new wife saw their home properly for the first time. She dismounted in the yard, turning slowly to take it all in. The house, the barn, the mountains rising beyond, the vast Montana sky overhead. "This is ours," she said wonderingly. "All of this. We get to build our life here. If you're sure. Last chance to change your mind, ride back to town, catch the stage east." Clara crossed to him and grabbed his coat, pulling him down for a kiss that silenced his doubts more effectively than any words could. When she pulled back, her eyes were fierce. "Stop giving me outs, Elias Ward. I'm here, I'm staying, and I'm going to make this ranch thrive if it kills me. Now show me my home." He showed her through the house, pointing out improvements and apologizing for what he hadn't had time to fix. But Clara seemed delighted by all of it. The simple furniture, the wood stove, the bedroom where he'd hung curtains and made up the bed with blankets that had been his grandmother's. She explored every corner with genuine interest, already planning changes and improvements, already making it theirs instead of just his. That night, their first as husband and wife, they sat by the fire and talked about the future. Clara wanted to learn ranching properly, wanted to be a true partner in the work rather than just maintaining the household. Elias wanted to expand the herd come spring, repair more of the outbuildings, maybe hire a hand if they could afford it. They made plans that were equal parts practical and hopeful, mapping out a life that would require everything they had to give, but might, with work and luck and love, become something worth all the sacrifices. And when they finally climbed into bed, exhausted and happy, and more than a little nervous about this new intimacy, Clara curled into Elias's arms with a sigh of contentment. "No regrets?" he asked quietly, stroking her hair. "Not a single one. You?" "Just that it took me 3 lonely years to be ready for you when you arrived. Maybe you needed those 3 years. Maybe we both needed our separate journeys to be ready for this one together." She tilted her face up to kiss his jaw. "We're exactly where we're supposed to be, Elias. I've never been more certain of anything." He held her close, listening to her breathing slow into sleep, and thought about Christmas wishes and stagecoaches and Eastern women brave enough to choose hard, beautiful lives over easy, empty ones. Thought about how sometimes the best gifts came disguised as complications, how love could heal wounds you didn't know you carried, how 2 people from different worlds could build a bridge between them. One honest conversation, one shared challenge, one chosen moment at a time. The weeks that followed tested them both in ways they'd anticipated and ways they hadn't. Clara's learning curve was steep. She burned meals, broke dishes, struggled with the relentless physical demands of ranch work. There were days when Elias came in from checking cattle to find her in tears of frustration, exhausted and discouraged and questioning her abilities. But there were also moments of unexpected joy. The first loaf of bread that came out perfectly. The morning Clara successfully milked the cow without getting kicked. The evening she spotted a predator approaching the chicken coop and drove it off with well-aimed shots from the rifle Martha Tucker had taught her to use. Elias kept his promise to treat her as an equal partner, teaching rather than commanding, asking for her input on decisions rather than making them unilaterally. And Clara kept hers to work without complaint, to find joy in small victories, to trust his experience while also bringing her own perspective to how they managed the ranch. They developed rhythms and routines. Early mornings feeding livestock together. Afternoons when Clara would study the ranching manuals Elias owned while he worked on repairs. Evenings by the fire, talking about the day's challenges and the next day's plans. Nights in each other's arms, building intimacy that went beyond the physical into genuine partnership. 2 months into their marriage, a late-season blizzard trapped them inside for 3 days. The isolation that might have driven Clara mad instead became a gift. Time to simply be together without the demands of work. Time to talk and laugh and make love and remember why they'd chosen this. On the second day, snowed in and content, Clara looked up from the book she was reading and said something that stopped Elias's heart. "I wrote to my parents again, told them about the wedding, about our life here, about how happy I am despite everything being harder than I imagined. She set the book aside. I don't expect them to respond, but I wanted them to know that their daughter is exactly where she belongs. What if they never forgive you? Then I'll grieve that loss and keep living anyway. But I had to try. Had to leave the door open on my end, even if they keep it closed on theirs. Clara moved to sit beside him, curling into his side with familiar ease. I've learned something these past months. You can love people and still choose a different life than they want for you. And maybe someday they'll understand that my choosing you wasn't rejecting them. It was choosing myself. Elias kissed the top of her head, aching for the family connection she'd sacrificed, but so grateful she'd made that sacrifice for him, for them, for the life they were building together. You're stronger than anyone I've ever known. We're stronger together. That's what matters. When spring finally arrived, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings, they stood together on the porch watching the snow recede and the first green shoots push through the mud. The Circle W had survived another winter, and this time Elias hadn't survived it alone. Clara was beside him, windburned and work-roughened, her hands calloused and her face tanned, looking nothing like the refined Eastern woman who'd stepped off that December stagecoach. She looked like she belonged here, like she'd always belonged here, like Montana had been waiting for her all along. James wrote, Clara said, waving a letter she'd received in town the previous week. He's planning another survey expedition in May. Wants to know if you'll guide again, and if I want to come along. Do you? I do, but differently this time. Not as a client learning the country, but as your partner who knows it. I want to show him what I've become, what we've built together. She smiled. And I want him to report back to my parents that their daughter is thriving, not just surviving. Maybe it won't change anything, but maybe it will. Then we'll do it together. Elias pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her against his side. Everything together from now on. Clara turned in his arms, her gray eyes, the eyes that had caught him that first day in Pine Creek, shining with love and certainty and hard-won joy. Everything together. I wouldn't have it any other way. They kissed there on the porch of the Circle W ranch, two people from different worlds who'd found their common ground in Montana territory, who'd chosen each other against all advice and built something real from nothing but determination and love. And if anyone had asked Elias in that moment whether his Christmas wish had come true, he would have said it had exceeded anything he'd dared to dream, because wishes were just hopes thrown into the universe. But Clara was real, solid, permanent, his wife, his partner, his home, and that was better than any wish could ever be. Spring transformed the Montana landscape with a speed that still caught Elias by surprise even after all his years in the territory. One week the world was brown and muddy, snow melting in dirty rivulets down the mountainsides. The next, wildflowers exploded across the meadows in riots of color, Indian paintbrush and lupine, columbine and glacier lilies, turning the ranch into something out of a storybook. Clara greeted each new blossom with the enthusiasm of someone discovering miracles, pressing flowers between the pages of Elias's mother's old Bible and learning their names from a botanical guide Mrs. Henderson had loaned her. She'd spent the winter becoming competent. Spring was making her confident. She could rope a calf now, deliver a breech birth, read weather signs with reasonable accuracy. She'd stopped asking Elias for permission and started making decisions, and he loved watching her grow into the role of rancher's wife, partner, equal. They were preparing for James Whitford's return, scheduled for mid-May with a full surveying team and proper equipment. But they were also preparing for something more significant. Clara's parents had written back. The letter had arrived on a warm April morning, delivered by Tommy Chen, who'd ridden out from town specifically because he knew how much it mattered. Clara's hands had shaken as she opened it, and Elias had stood beside her, one hand on her shoulder, ready to provide whatever comfort or celebration the moment required. Her mother had written again, and this time the tone was different. Still hurt, still struggling to understand, but reaching toward acceptance. She wrote that Clara's most recent letters, the ones describing her new life with honest detail, neither romanticizing the hardships nor apologizing for her happiness, had forced them to see their daughter's choice differently. Not as rejection or rebellion, but as genuine pursuit of a life that fit her in ways their planned future never had. Her father had read the letters too, her mother wrote. He remained silent on the subject, his pride wounded and his plans disrupted. But he'd ask questions. What kind of man was this Elias Ward? What kind of life was Clara actually living? Was she truly happy or just too stubborn to admit her mistake? And then, at the end of the letter, came the stunning news. They were coming west. They would arrive in late May, wanting to see for themselves what their daughter had chosen, to meet the man who'd inspired such dramatic change, to understand the life that Clara claimed was worth everything she'd given up for it. "They're coming," Clara had whispered, reading and rereading the crucial passage. "Elias, my parents are coming here." The news had filled Elias with equal parts hope and dread. This was Clara's chance to bridge the gap with her family, to show them she hadn't made a terrible mistake. But it was also his chance to fail spectacularly at making a good impression, to prove every doubt her parents had ever harbored about frontier ranchers and unsuitable marriages. "We'll make it good," he'd said, pulling Clara close. "We'll show them what we've built, who we are together. And then they'll see what I see, that you're exactly where you belong." Now, with May approaching and the ranch emerging from winter's grip, they threw themselves into preparations with renewed energy. Elias repaired the last of the outbuildings, replaced worn fence posts, organized the barn until even he had to admit it looked presentable. Clara worked on the house with Martha Tucker's help, creating a home that was simple but welcoming, rough but clean, poor by Eastern standards but rich in the ways that mattered. James Whitford arrived first, 3 weeks before Clara's parents were expected, bringing with him a surveying team of 4 men and enough equipment to make his previous expedition look like amateur exploration. He rode up to the Circle W on a warm afternoon and dismounted with a broad smile that told Elias everything had gone well back east. "Ward," he said, shaking hands with genuine warmth, "good to see you again. And Clara," he turned to his niece and stopped, really looking at her. "My God, you've changed." Clara laughed, spreading her arms to show off clothes more practical than pretty, boots worn from real work, hands that showed calluses and strength. "Is that good or bad, Uncle James?" "It's remarkable. You look—" He paused, searching for words. "You look like you've found yourself, like you've become who you were always meant to be." "I have." Clara moved to stand beside Elias, her hand finding his automatically. "This life, this place, this man, they've given me room to become myself instead of what everyone else wanted me to be." James's eyes moved between them, noting the easy intimacy, the unspoken communication, the way they stood together as a united front. His expression softened into something that might have been relief. "Your parents are going to have a hard time arguing with evidence this clear. You're happy, genuinely happy, in a way you never were back east." He gestured to his surveying team, still on their horses and waiting for direction. "Now where can we set up camp? We've got 2 weeks of work ahead, and I'd like to get started." The survey expedition was different this time. Elias and Clara worked as a team, guiding James's crew through the territory with practiced efficiency. Where before Elias had been teaching Clara the mountains, now they moved through them together, each complementing the other's strengths. Clara handled the horses with skill that impressed the hired men. Elias navigated the terrain with confidence that came from a lifetime's experience. Together, they kept the expedition running smoothly, avoided danger, and gave James exactly what he needed. On the 3rd night out, camped in a valley where hot springs steamed in the twilight, James pulled them aside while his crew was occupied with their own card game and conversation. "I need to prepare you both," he said without preamble. "Your parents, Clara, they're not coming west just to visit. Your father has plans." Clara's expression tightened. "What kind of plans?" "He's convinced himself that you've been taken advantage of, that you couldn't possibly be happy in these circumstances. He's planning to offer Elias a substantial sum of money to annul the marriage and send you back east." The words hit like a physical blow. Elias felt Clara stiffen beside him, felt his own anger rising hot and defensive. "He thinks I married his daughter for money? He thinks you're a fortune hunter who saw an opportunity and took it. I've tried to explain otherwise, shown him your letters, Clara, told him everything I witnessed. But he's a stubborn man who doesn't like being wrong, and admitting you made a good choice means admitting he was wrong about what you needed." James sighed heavily. I'm telling you this so you're prepared, so his offer doesn't catch you off guard and create a scene that makes everything worse. How much is he offering? Clara's voice was tight, controlled. Enough to pay off any debts, rebuild your ranch twice over, and set you up comfortably for the rest of your life. $10,000, Clara. He's serious about this. The sum was staggering. More money than Elias would see in 10 lifetimes of ranching, enough to transform the Circle W into something prosperous, to hire hands and buy equipment and never worry about lean winters again. For a moment, just a brief, treacherous moment, he let himself imagine what he could do with that kind of money. Then he looked at Clara, saw the fear in her eyes that he might actually consider it, and the moment passed into shame that he'd even hesitated. "Tell your brother," Elias said, meeting James's gaze steadily, "that his daughter is not for sale at any price. Tell him that I married Clara because I love her, because she's the strongest, bravest, most remarkable person I've ever known. Tell him that $10,000 wouldn't begin to compensate for losing her, and that if he wants to buy something, he can buy new surveying equipment for you because I'm not interested." Clara's hand found his, squeezing hard enough to hurt. "Thank you," she whispered. "Nothing to thank me for. You're my wife, my partner, my whole damn world." Elias turned to her fully, ignoring James's presence. "Your father can offer me $1 million, and my answer would be the same. You chose me when you had every reason not to. I'm not giving that up for anything." James smiled, looking satisfied. "That's what I told him you'd say. But he needed to hear it from me, and you needed to be prepared for the offer when it comes, which it will, probably within 5 minutes of his arrival. Let him offer. I'll refuse. And then we'll show him what we've built here, and maybe, just maybe, he'll see what everyone else already sees, that Clara and I are better together than we ever were apart." The rest of the survey expedition passed in a blur of work and planning. James completed his assessments with thorough precision, declaring the timber stands ideal for sustainable harvest and already making arrangements for his company to begin operations come fall. He offered Elias a contract to provide horses and guide services for the logging crews, which would bring steady income through the next several years. It was good news, hopeful news, proof that their hard work was leading somewhere beyond mere survival. But underlying everything was the approaching arrival of Clara's parents. The date grew closer with inexorable certainty, and Elias could see the tension building in Clara's shoulders, the worry in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. She was preparing for a confrontation she'd been dreading since the day she'd mailed her first letter announcing her decision to stay. They returned to the Circle W a week before her parents were expected, giving them time to prepare. The ranch looked as good as Elias could make it. Not wealthy, not impressive by Eastern standards, but solid and well-maintained and honest. The house was clean and comfortable. The livestock were healthy. The work was caught up as much as frontier work ever was. It would have to be enough. On the night before her parents' arrival, Clara couldn't sleep. Elias found her on the porch well past midnight, wrapped in a blanket and staring at the stars that seemed close enough to touch in the clear mountain air. "Nervous?" he asked, settling beside her. "Terrified. What if seeing me here, seeing our life, just confirms everything they feared? What if they think I've thrown my life away and they can't forgive me for it? Then we keep living well, keep being happy, and hope that eventually time and distance give them perspective." Elias pulled her close, sharing warmth. "But Clara, I've been thinking about something. Your father's going to offer me that money, just like James warned, and I'm going to refuse it. But maybe we should hear him out, let him say what he needs to say, give him the chance to see that his offer doesn't tempt me even slightly." "You want him to try to buy you off?" "I want him to see that it doesn't work, that his money has no power here because what we have is worth more than any amount he could offer." Elias tilted her face up to meet his eyes. "I want him to understand, really understand, that you're not a commodity to be purchased or a mistake to be corrected. You're my wife, my choice, my future, and no price tag changes that." Clara kissed him then, fierce and grateful, and Elias tasted salt on her lips and realized she was crying. I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "I know, I love you the same way, the scary, overwhelming, change everything kind of love." He held her until her tears stopped, until the sky began to lighten with approaching dawn. "We'll get through tomorrow together. just like we've gotten through everything else. Clara's parents arrived on the afternoon stage, and half of Pine Creek turned out to witness it. Word had spread about the Eastern family coming to judge their daughter's frontier marriage, and everyone who'd helped Clara and Elias had a stake in the outcome. Mrs. Henderson stood outside her mercantile with crossed arms and a defiant expression. Doc Brennan waited near the hotel, ready to intervene if tensions escalated. Even Martha Tucker had ridden in from her ranch, claiming she needed supplies but really wanting to support Clara through what everyone knew would be difficult. The stagecoach pulled up in a cloud of dust, and Elias watched as a man who could only be Clara's father emerged first. Richard Whitford was tall, well-dressed despite the journey, with iron gray hair and the kind of bearing that came from a lifetime of being obeyed. His expression was set in lines of disapproval as he surveyed Pine Creek with obvious distaste. Clara's mother followed, smaller and softer than her husband, but with the same straight spine. Margaret Whitford's eyes scanned the gathered crowd, found Clara standing beside Elias, and something in her face crumpled briefly before she controlled it. "Clara," Margaret said, her voice carrying across the distance. "My dear girl." Clara stepped forward, and for a moment Elias thought she might run to her mother, but she controlled herself, walking with measured dignity until she stood before her parents, a daughter they barely recognized confronting the life she'd chosen. "Mother, Father, thank you for coming." Clara's voice was steady, though Elias could see her hands trembling. "I know this isn't easy for you." "Easy?" Richard's voice was clipped, angry. "You abandon your family, your obligations, your entire future for—" He gestured dismissively at Pine Creek, at Elias, at everything Clara had chosen. "For this? And you expect us to find it easy? I expect you to try to understand. But if you can't, I'll accept that too." Clara turned, extending her hand toward Elias. "Father, Mother, this is my husband, Elias Ward. Elias, my parents, Richard and Margaret Whitford." Elias stepped forward, offering his hand to Richard with as much dignity as he could muster. "Sir, ma'am, welcome to Montana Territory." Richard looked at the extended hand like it might be diseased, but years of ingrained manners won out. He shook briefly, his grip hard and challenging. Margaret took Elias's hand more gently, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that reminded him of Clara. "You're younger than I expected," Margaret said quietly. 26, ma'am. Clara's 23. Not so young that we didn't know our own minds. And yet young enough to make impulsive decisions you'll regret for the rest of your lives." Richard's voice was sharp. "Mr. Ward, I'd like to speak with you privately. Before we see this ranch of yours, before my daughter shows us whatever she thinks will convince us, I'd like a frank conversation, man to man." Clara stiffened. "Father, I don't think—" "It's all right," Elias said, squeezing her hand once before releasing it. "Your father's come a long way. He deserves to speak his piece." They went into the hotel's small private dining room, just the two of them, while Clara waited outside with her mother and an anxious James Whitford. Richard closed the door with deliberate care, then turned to face Elias with an expression that mixed anger, pain, and determination in equal measure. "I'm going to be blunt, Mr. Ward, because I have no patience for dancing around difficult subjects. I think you saw an opportunity in my daughter, a wealthy, naive girl looking for adventure. And you took advantage of her youth and inexperience to trap her in a marriage that serves your interests but destroys hers." Elias kept his voice level despite the anger rising in his chest. "You're wrong, sir. On every count." "Am I? You're a struggling rancher with a property that's barely surviving. Clara comes from wealth and privilege. The math isn't complicated." "You're right that the math isn't complicated, but you're calculating wrong." Elias moved to the window, looking out at Pine Creek's rough buildings, gathering his thoughts. "I tried to send Clara away multiple times, told her she was making a mistake, that she should take time to think, that she deserved better than what I could offer. She's the one who insisted, who chose this life knowing exactly what it meant. Because you manipulated her into thinking I did nothing but tell her the truth." Elias turned back, meeting Richard's glare steadily. "The truth that winters here are brutal, that the work is relentless, that she'd be giving up comfort and society and family approval, that I had nothing to offer her but honesty and partnership and love. She knew all that, Mr. Whitford, and she chose me anyway. Then she's more foolish than I thought. Or braver. Strong enough to choose authenticity over comfort, purpose over ease. Your daughter isn't the fragile society girl you think she is, sir. She's remarkable, capable, and determined, and tougher than most men I know. She's thriving here, not despite the hardships, but because of them. Because this life lets her be fully herself in ways your world never did. Richard's expression didn't soften, but something flickered in his eyes, doubt, maybe, or unwilling recognition. You're well-spoken for a frontier rancher. My mother was a school teacher. She believed education mattered regardless of where you lived. Elias paused, then decided to address the elephant directly. James said you'd be offering me money to annul the marriage. If you're planning to do that, let's get it over with. $10,000. Enough to rebuild your ranch, hire help, never worry about money again. All you have to do is end this farce of a marriage and send Clara back where she belongs. No. You haven't heard my full offer. I don't need to. The answer is no. Elias's voice was firm, final. Your daughter is not for sale, Mr. Whitford. Not for 10,000, not for 100,000. I married her because I love her, because life without her is just survival, but life with her is actually living. That's not something money can replace or compensate for. You'd turn down financial security, a chance to make something real of your ranch? I already have something real. I have Clara. I have a partnership built on honesty and respect and shared work. I have a woman who chose me when she could have had anyone, who sees value in this life that you can't or won't see. Elias moved closer, making sure Richard heard every word. You can't buy me off because you don't have anything I want more than what I already have. And until you understand that, until you see Clara as the strong, capable woman she is, rather than the obedient daughter you wish she'd been, you're never going to understand the choice she made. Richard stared at him for a long moment, his jaw working like he wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. Finally, he said, "You're either the most honorable man I've met or the most skillful liar. I'm just a man who knows what matters, and Clara matters more than anything else." They stood in tense silence until Richard finally nodded, just once, a brief acknowledgement that wasn't quite acceptance, but might be the beginning of understanding. "Show me this ranch, then. Show me this life my daughter chose, and we'll see if it's everything you claim." The ride out to the Circle W felt endless. Clara drove the wagon with her mother beside her, while James rode alongside providing neutral conversation. Elias and Richard followed on horseback, maintaining careful distance, each measuring the other and finding the encounter more complex than anticipated. When they crested the final rise and the ranch came into view, Elias tried to see it through Eastern eyes. The main house was modest, the outbuildings functional but plain. The fenced pastures held cattle that were healthy but not impressive in number. It was, by any objective measure, a small operation struggling to survive in hard country. But then he saw it through Clara's eyes, the mountains rising beyond, the meadows bright with wildflowers, the creek running clear and cold through the property, the solid house built by his father's hands, the barn that sheltered their livestock, the land that fed and sustained them. It wasn't wealth, but it was honest and real and theirs. Clara brought the wagon to a stop in the yard and helped her mother down with gentle hands. Margaret Whitford looked around with wide eyes, taking in every detail, and Elias couldn't read her expression, shock, disappointment, or something else entirely. "This is your home?" Margaret asked quietly. "This is our home," Clara confirmed, emphasis on the our. "Let me show you." She led them through the house with visible pride, pointing out improvements she and Elias had made, explaining their daily routines, demonstrating her competence with the wood stove and the other frontier necessities she'd mastered. Margaret followed, asking questions that seemed genuinely curious rather than critical. Richard remained mostly silent, his sharp eyes cataloging everything, his expression unreadable. In the kitchen, Clara showed her mother the bread she'd baked that morning, the butter she'd churned, the vegetables she'd preserved from last year's garden. Margaret picked up the bread, examining it with the kind of attention usually reserved for fine art. "You made this yourself? Without servants or a proper oven?" "I learned. Mrs. Henderson taught me, and I practiced until I got it right. It took weeks before I could make anything edible, but I was determined. Clara smiled, a small, proud smile. I wanted to be able to contribute, to be a real partner rather than just ornamental. And the rest of it? The ranching work, the livestock, the endless labor? I do what I can. I'm still learning, still making mistakes, but I'm getting stronger, capable, useful. Clara met her mother's eyes. I know this isn't the life you planned for me, but it's the life I chose, and I'm good at it, Mother. Better than I ever was at being a society lady. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. You are good at it. I can see that. This house, your competence, the way you carry yourself. You've changed, Clara. You've become someone I barely recognize but can't help admiring. In the barn, Clara showed her father the horses, explaining their personalities and purposes with the kind of detailed knowledge that came from daily interaction. She demonstrated how to properly saddle a horse, her movements efficient and practiced. Richard watched in silence, and Elias saw the moment when the older man's carefully maintained disapproval began to crack. You actually do this work? Richard asked. It's not just performance for our benefit? Every day, sometimes twice a day when calving season hits or when weather turns and we need to bring the herd in. Clara led Patience out of her stall, the mare nickering with recognition. This is Patience. She carried me through my first real test here, when we rode into an avalanche to save Uncle James and Elias. She's brave and steady, and I love her like family. An avalanche? Margaret's voice went high with alarm. James didn't tell you. Clara glanced at her uncle, who looked sheepish. We were caught in unstable snow during the first survey. Patience saved us. And that's when I knew, when I was facing death and all I could think was that I refused to die before I'd really lived, that's when I knew this was where I belonged. They spent the rest of the afternoon touring the ranch, Clara and Elias explaining their operation, their plans for expansion, the contract with James's timber company that would provide steady income. Richard asked hard questions about finances and sustainability. Margaret asked softer questions about daily life in isolation and happiness. And gradually, as the sun moved across the sky, something shifted in the way Clara's parents looked at their daughter's chosen life. As evening approached, they gathered on the porch where Elias and Clara often sat watching the mountains turn gold with sunset. Margaret had been quiet for the past hour, and now she reached out to take Clara's hand with a grip that spoke of years of love and fear and reluctant letting go. I need to apologize, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. When you first wrote that you were staying, that you'd married a man we'd never met, I thought you were being reckless, throwing away your future on a romantic fantasy that would crumble as soon as reality set in. I thought we'd failed you somehow, hadn't prepared you properly for the world. Mother, let me finish. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand. But seeing you here, seeing this life you've built, watching you work and laugh and move through your day with such purpose, I realize we didn't fail you. We just didn't understand you, didn't see that the life we wanted for you would have been a beautiful cage that kept you from becoming who you're meant to be. Clara was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. I never wanted to hurt you, but I couldn't breathe there anymore. I was suffocating under the weight of should and ought and proper. I know, dear heart, I see that now. Margaret pulled Clara into her arms, and Elias watched as mother and daughter held each other with the kind of desperate relief that came from bridging a chasm both had feared was permanent. You're happy here, genuinely happy in a way you never were back east, and that's all a mother really wants for her child. Richard cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional display, but unwilling to break the moment. When Margaret and Clara finally separated, wiping eyes and laughing through tears, he stepped forward with the stiff formality that seemed to be his default. Mr. Ward, I owe you an apology as well. I came here convinced you'd taken advantage of my daughter, that you were a fortune hunter or a scoundrel who'd trapped a naive girl. I was prepared to hate you on sight and do everything in my power to end this marriage. I know, sir. I don't blame you for that. You should. It was arrogant and presumptuous and unfair to both of you. Richard's expression softened, just slightly. But watching you with Clara today, seeing how you work together, how you respect her capabilities rather than just protecting her fragility, I see that she didn't make a mistake. She made a choice, a good choice, even if it's not the one I would have made for her. Elias extended his hand, and this time when Richard shook it, there was warmth in the grip, respect, if not quite approval. Thank you for coming, sir, for being willing to see past your expectations to what actually is. Don't thank me yet. I'm still struggling with the reality of my daughter living in the Montana wilderness miles from civilization. I'll probably always struggle with it. Richard paused, then added gruffly, but I can see she's in capable hands, and that she's capable herself, which matters more. They stayed for dinner, Margaret helping Clara prepare the meal with the kind of companionable ease that spoke of years of shared kitchens. Richard and Elias sat on the porch with James, talking about the timber contract and ranching economics, finding common ground in business discussion that transcended their different worlds. And when they finally sat down to eat, the meal simple but well prepared, it felt less like strangers forcing conversation and more like family learning to be family again. After dinner, as the sky darkened and stars emerged in their millions, Richard asked to speak with Elias privately once more. They walked out to the barn, the older man moving stiffly after the long day but determined. I want to withdraw my offer, Richard said without preamble. The money, the bribe, whatever you want to call it. It was wrong of me to make it, and I know now it would have insulted you both. I appreciate that, sir. But I do want to offer something else. Not a bribe, not a payment, just support. Financial help to make this ranch succeed, to give you both some security. Not because I think you need rescuing, but because Clara is still my daughter, and I want to help her build the life she's chosen. Elias considered this carefully, understanding the difference Richard was trying to articulate. That's generous, sir, but Clara and I need to discuss it before we accept anything. We've been building this on our own, and there's pride in that. Value in knowing we can survive without help. Pride is fine until it's all you have to eat in a hard winter. Richard's voice was dry, but not unkind. I'm not trying to buy my way back into my daughter's good graces. I'm trying to be a father who supports his child's choices, even when they're not the choices he'd make. There's a difference. There is. And we'll consider it, discuss it, let you know. Elias paused, then added, but what would mean more than money, sir, is your approval, your acceptance. Clara needs to know that choosing this life doesn't mean losing her family. Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dark mountains. She has my acceptance. Not my full understanding, maybe, because I'll never fully comprehend why someone would choose this hard life over comfort. But my acceptance, my acknowledgement that she's happy and capable and building something worthwhile. She has that. Tell her that, if you can find the words better than I can. Tell her yourself, sir. She needs to hear it from you. They walked back to the house to find Clara and Margaret on the porch, wrapped in blankets and talking quietly. Richard sat beside his daughter with obvious awkwardness, then took a breath and spoke with more honesty than Elias had yet heard from him. Clara, your mother and I are returning east tomorrow, and I need to say some things before we go. I don't understand your choices. I probably never will. The life you've chosen seems impossibly hard to me, full of sacrifices I can't imagine making, but I see that it's your choice, made with full knowledge and genuine commitment. And I see that you're happy. Happier than I ever saw you in Boston, to be honest. Clara reached for her father's hand, holding it gently. Thank you for seeing that, for trying to understand even when it's hard. I'm trying. God knows I'm trying. Richard's voice roughened. You're still my daughter, Clara. Nothing changes that. And if this is the life you want, the man you want, then I'll support it. Not by trying to buy you out of it or convince you you've made a mistake, but by accepting that you know your own mind better than I ever gave you credit for. That's all I wanted. Your acceptance, your blessing. I never wanted to hurt you or disappoint you, but I couldn't keep being the person you needed me to be when it meant giving up the person I actually am. They talked late into the night, healing wounds that had festered for months, finding their way back to each other across the distance that choice and consequence had created. And when Clara's parents finally retired to the hotel in Pine Creek, where they'd be staying, when it was just Elias and Clara again in the quiet house, they held each other with the relief of survivors who'd made it through the hardest test yet. They came around, Clara whispered against his chest. I didn't dare hope they would, but they did. Your mother came around because she saw how happy you are. Your father came around because he saw how capable you are. Both of them came around because they love you enough to put your happiness above their preferences. Elias kissed the top of her head. But Clara, we need to talk about your father's offer. The support, not the bribe. Do we want it? I don't know. Part of me wants to refuse on principle, to prove we can make it on our own. But another part, the practical part, knows that help could make the difference between barely surviving and actually thriving. She pulled back to look at him. What do you think? I think pride is fine, but stupidity isn't. If your father wants to invest in the ranch, not buy his way into our lives, but genuinely support what we're building, we'd be fools to refuse. We can use the money to hire help, buy better equipment, expand the herd, make this place successful instead of just sustainable. It wouldn't be charity. We'd pay him back eventually. Or we'd consider it an investment, a stake in what we're building. Either way, we decide together, as partners. Elias smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. What do you want to do? Clara thought about it, really considered it, then nodded slowly. I want to accept. Not because we need rescuing, but because it's a bridge back to my family. A way for them to be part of this life, even though they're not living it. And because you're right, we'd be fools to let pride stop us from building something really good here. Then we'll tell them tomorrow before they leave. Set terms that work for everyone. Make it official and businesslike so your father feels comfortable and we feel independent. Elias pulled her close again, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her in his arms. We're going to be all right, Clara. Better than all right. We're going to thrive. The next morning brought farewells that were bittersweet but hopeful. Richard and Margaret prepared to return east with promises to write regularly, to visit again in the fall, to begin bridging the distance that geography would always impose but family could overcome. Richard and Elias finalized the investment terms with a handshake and an agreement to formalize everything in writing once Richard returned to Boston. Margaret gave Clara recipes and advice and enough tears to water the entire ranch. But it was what Richard said to Elias in those final moments, out of Clara's hearing, that stayed with him the longest. Take care of her, Ward. Not because she needs protecting, I see now that she doesn't, but because she's precious and rare and worth everything you can give her. Every day for the rest of my life, sir, you have my word. They watched the stagecoach pull away, Clara's hand tight in Elias's, both of them feeling the bittersweetness of restoration and separation combined. Her family accepted her now, supported her choice, but they were leaving, returning to the world Clara had left behind. The reunion had been everything they'd hoped for and more, but it couldn't change the fundamental reality of the life Clara had chosen. No regrets? Elias asked as the stage disappeared from view. Not a single one. Clara turned to him, her eyes clear and certain. I have my family's blessing now, which I didn't dare hope for. But even if I didn't, even if they'd left still disapproving, I'd still choose this. Choose you. Choose us. They rode back to the Circle W through country beginning to bloom with full spring glory, and when they crested the rise that gave view of their home, Elias reined in his horse, seized by sudden inspiration. I want to show you something. A place I haven't been since before my parents died. A place my mother loved. He led Clara off the main trail, following paths he knew by heart, but hadn't traveled in years. They rode for an hour into the foothills, climbing steadily, until they emerged into a hidden valley that took Clara's breath away. Wildflowers covered every inch of available ground. Lupine and paintbrush, columbine and glacier lilies, varieties Elias couldn't name, creating a tapestry of color that seemed impossible, magical. A small waterfall fed a crystal pool at one end of the valley, and the mountains rose beyond like guardians protecting something precious. Elias, Clara breathed. I don't have words. My mother called it Hope Valley. She found it the first spring after they settled here, when she was lonely and homesick and questioning whether they'd made a terrible mistake leaving Ohio. She said this place reminded her that even in the hardest country, beauty could grow if you gave it time and patience. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Elias dismounted and helped Clara down, leading her to a flat rock overlooking the valley. He'd been planning this for weeks, carrying the ring he'd had made in Pine Creek. Simple, just a band of Montana gold with a small sapphire the color of winter skies, the color of Clara's eyes. We got married in practicality and necessity, he said, taking her hands. Fast and simple because it was the right thing to do, the thing we both wanted. But we never had the romance of it, the gesture, the moment. Elias, what are you... He dropped to one knee in the wildflowers, pulling out the ring, seeing her eyes go wide with surprise and joy. Clara Ward, you're already my wife, but I want to ask you properly, in the most beautiful place I know, with all the time in the world instead of rushed by necessity. Will you marry me? Will you keep choosing me, keep building this life with me, keep being brave and strong and extraordinary? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that your Christmas wish was my Christmas miracle? Clara was crying, laughing, dropping to her knees in front of him and cupping his face in her hands. Yes, yes, absolutely yes, you ridiculous, wonderful man. I already married you once, and I'd marry you 1,000 more times. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and she kissed him there among the wildflowers, while the waterfall sang and the mountains stood witness. It was perfect, Elias thought. Not the grand romantic gesture Eastern society would have expected, but something real and true, and theirs. They spent the afternoon in Hope Valley, talking about the future they were building, making plans that were equal parts practical and dreaming. With Richard's investment, they could hire 2 hands for summer and fall, which would let them expand the herd substantially. They could build a proper bunkhouse, repair the irrigation system, maybe even add rooms to the main house for the children they both hoped would come eventually. I want to bring students here, Clara said suddenly, looking around the valley with thoughtful eyes. The children I teach in Pine Creek, most of them have never seen anything like this. I want to organize expeditions, teach them about the country they live in, show them that Montana isn't just harsh, it's beautiful too. You want to be a teacher and a rancher? I want to be everything I'm capable of being. Why should I have to choose? She smiled at him, that fierce, bright smile he'd first seen in the snow. You married a complicated woman, Elias Ward. Better get used to it. I married an extraordinary woman who makes me want to be extraordinary too. I'm already used to it. They returned to the ranch as evening fell, riding side by side through country that belonged to them in ways that went beyond legal ownership. This was their home, their land, their future taking root in Montana soil. And when they reached the house and Elias helped Clara dismount, she paused in the yard, looking around with an expression he'd never seen before. Perfect contentment, mixed with fierce determination. What are you thinking? He asked. That we're going to make this place legendary. Not just successful, not just sustainable, but something people talk about. The Circle W Ranch, where an Eastern lady and a lonely cowboy built something extraordinary out of nothing but love and stubbornness and hard work. She turned to him, her eyes blazing with the same passion he'd seen when she'd announced she was staying in Pine Creek. We're going to prove that choosing the hard thing doesn't mean choosing the lesser thing. That love and partnership and shared purpose can build something that lasts. Elias pulled her close. There in the yard of the ranch they were transforming together, under the Montana sky that had witnessed their first meeting and would witness every day of their shared future. We've already proved that, Clara. Everything else is just details. That summer, they hired 2 hands as planned, young men looking for honest work and willing to learn. They expanded the herd, repaired years of neglect, and started building the bunkhouse that would let them grow the operation further. Clara continued teaching in Pine Creek 3 days a week, becoming a fixture in town, known for her competence and warmth and the fierce way she loved the frontier she'd chosen. James Whitford's timber company began operations in the fall, and Elias's guide contract brought steady income that let them reinvest in the ranch. Richard's investment had been formalized with proper paperwork, structured as a loan they'd repay over 10 years, but which both sides understood was really just a father supporting his daughter's dream. Letters came regularly from Boston, Margaret's warm and newsy, Richard's shorter but gradually softening. Clara's younger brother wrote too, apologizing for his initial reaction and expressing cautious interest in visiting the following summer. The family she'd feared losing was finding its way back to her, changed but intact. And on a cold November morning, Clara woke Elias before dawn with urgent news. She was pregnant. They were going to be parents come spring, bringing new life into the world they'd built together. Elias held her as she cried happy tears and felt something in his chest unlock that he hadn't even known was still closed. His family had ended with influenza and death. Now it was beginning again with Clara and life and hope. Winter came and went, easier with hired help and better preparation, with two people facing it together instead of one person enduring it alone. Clara grew round with their child, slowing down but never stopping, insisting on helping with the work until Elias and the ranch hands practically had to restrain her. And on an April morning when wildflowers were just beginning to push through the last of the snow, Clara gave birth to a daughter they named Hope, after the valley where Elias had proposed properly, after the thing that had brought them both through their hardest seasons. Elias held his daughter for the first time while Doc Brennan cleaned up, and Clara recovered, and he thought about Christmas wishes and stagecoaches, and the way life could transform in the space between one breath and the next. He thought about the lonely man he'd been, convinced he needed nothing and no one beyond survival. And he looked at Clara, exhausted but radiant, reaching for their daughter with capable hands that bore calluses from ranch work and ink stains from teaching, and knew that every moment of doubt, every hard choice, every sacrifice had led to this. "She's perfect," Clara whispered as Elias placed Hope in her arms. "We made something perfect, Elias." "We made something real," he corrected gently. "Something honest and true and ours. That's better than perfect." Clara looked up at him, those gray eyes he'd first seen across a snow-covered street now full of love and contentment and bone-deep satisfaction. "Do you ever think about that first day? When I stepped off the stagecoach and you looked at me like I was a complication you didn't want?" "I think about it every day, and I think about how spectacularly wrong I was." Elias sat on the bed beside his wife and daughter, his family, his entire world. "You weren't a complication. You were the answer to a question I'd stopped asking. You were everything I needed without knowing I needed it." "Your Christmas wish," Clara said softly, remembering. "My Christmas wish that came true the moment you rode into town." Elias kissed her forehead, then his daughter's, "and keeps coming true every day after." They sat together in the quiet house, new parents beginning a new chapter, partners who'd built something lasting from 2 weeks of shared danger and a lifetime of shared commitment. Outside, spring was transforming Montana into something magical, wildflowers covering the meadows and green returning to the mountains. The Circle W Ranch was thriving, no longer just surviving, proof that hard work and love could create something extraordinary. And on the porch, where they'd spent so many evenings watching the mountains turn gold with sunset, where Elias had spent 3 lonely years before Clara arrived, there was no longer any silence. There was laughter and conversation and the sounds of a life fully lived. There was the future they were building together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one shared moment at a time. Clara had ridden into town on a December stagecoach, and she'd never left. She'd chosen the hard, beautiful life over the easy, empty one, chosen partnership over propriety, chosen love over comfort. And in choosing, she'd given Elias back something he'd lost when his family died, the ability to hope, to dream, to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. His Christmas wish had come true, but more than that, it had exceeded anything he'd dared to imagine. Because wishes were just hopes thrown into the universe, ephemeral and uncertain. But Clara was real, solid, permanent, his wife, his partner, his home. And that was better than any wish could ever be. The end.